Chapter 39. Devastation of all the islands of Britain by heathens. The Annals of Ulster, 794 A.D. Bridget Nickmore-Sheknell could not believe how stupid these people were. She had known Norsemen, Harald most intimately, and so her expectations were not high. She had not expected to find philosophers and sages among the great filthy beasts who had turned the little town of Duvlin into a reeking, depraved Longport. But she had expected better than this. Not from Harald, of course. She understood Harald, could play him better than she could play the lyre, and she played the lyre most excellently. Harald did not act, he reacted. Eating, fornicating, fighting. Those were the things that set him in motion. That and his wildly unshakable love for her. If she whistled, Harald came bounding, tongue lolling from his mouth. She had never owned a dog that was better trained than Harald. The others were the same as far as what stimulated them to action, but unlike Harald, she could not control them. Perhaps if they spoke her language, as Harald did, to a surprising degree, then she could have played on them as well. But they did not, and so Bridget could only hope the Northmen did nothing irreversibly stupid, and then suffer disappointment when they did. She looked out over the rain-soaked field at the distant camp, the cluster of tents at which Thorgrim and Oenolf and the rest were pointing and jabbering away in their barbaric language. They are accustomed to matching swords with other heathens, she thought, not matching wits with the Irish. As much as she loathed Morrigan, she recognized that the bitch possessed considerable skill in the art of trickery, manipulation, and the use of herbs. Or magic, black magic. It would come as no shock to Bridget to discover Morrigan had summoned up the forces of the devil, and that she had unleashed them on the idiot Arenbjorn and defeated his entire army. With a pig, apparently. Except Thorgrim, she reminded herself. She did not beat Thorgrim. And Bridget was sorry for that. There was something frightening about Thorgrim, something she did not understand. She had no influence on him. He seemed hardly to notice her. Whatever she had to do to regain her throne, she knew it would be harder if Thorgrim was there. The water was running in streams down her hair and face as she looked out over the dull green fields, up the long sloping hill, at the curved walls of Tara. It was not so far away, but it seemed to Bridget just then that it might as well have been on the moon, and the sight of it created all at once a desperate longing in her, a sense of despair, and a spark of renewed determination that even the rain could not quench. Tara, it was hers by right. It would be hers again. The heathens were still jabbering, pointing in one direction and another, from the ring fort to the cluster of tents and flags. Bridget could see horses and men walking about, but she did not know what it meant. Why would Morrigan have men in the field, she thought, when they might be perfectly safe within the walls? After some time of listening to the Northmen's talk, which sounded to her like just so much porcine grunting, Bridget turned to Harald. "What is going on?" she demanded. "What are you, discussing?" Harald pointed across the field. "That, Tara," he said in his broken Irish. "I know it's bloody Tara," Bridget thought, and clenched her teeth to cut off the biting retort forming in her gut. She forced herself to remain silent. Harald's arm swung around until he was pointing at the cluster of tents. "And there, men at arms in camp." He paused as he figured how to express the next bit in the Irish tongue. "We don't know how many. Big army, maybe, many." "Are they not Morrigan's men?" Bridget asked. "The men-at-arms from Tara?" Harald shook his head. "Morrigan, her men, In Tara. Bridget nodded. There was her answer as to why Morrigan would send her men beyond the walls of the ring-fort. She hadn't. These were someone else's men. But whose? Bridget's mind started sorting through the possibilities. They were Irish, of that she was certain. She had seen enough Irish camps and enough Norse to recognize the difference. If they were not inside the walls of Tara, then they were not Morrigan's friends. And if they were Morrigan's enemies, then perhaps they were friends of hers, or at least potential allies. She wiped the rain from her eyes and peered across the open ground. It was 3/4 of a mile, at least, maybe more, and she could not make out any details of the camp. There were banners flogging around in the wind-driven rain, and she felt certain that if she could get a good look at them, then she would know whose camp that was. There was no Rhi Tuatha, or any other minor king within marching distance whose colours she would not recognize. "We must get closer," she said to Harold. "What? Closer? We must get closer, you and me. We must see who this is, how many, what they want." Harold looked a bit bewildered at the thought, but he turned to Thorgrim and Owenolf and spoke fast. The two older men looked out over the field of the distant camp, and then back at Bridget. Owenolf spoke. Harold translated. "Owenolf says he will send his man. See, what army?" Bridget shook her head. "Idiots," she thought. "You will not know who it is, friend or enemy. I will. We'll go, you and me. Come back and tell Owenolf." Harold nodded as she spoke, confirming that he understood. He turned and related the words to Thorgrim and Owenolf, which led in turn to more gibberish from them. Harold turned back to Bridget. "Owenolf says, good. We go, you and me." "Good," Bridget said, though in truth she was annoyed by their apparent lack of concern for her safety. She was sure that the drunken old buggerer, Owenolf, did not care if she lived or died. But Thorgrim might have expressed a stronger objection to her putting herself in danger, or at least insisted that she take a bigger guard than just Harold. But instead, they seemed ready to let her expose herself to unknown risks, with no effort made to stop her. Indeed, they were no longer even paying her any attention. "Fine," she thought. "You will most assuredly be sorry." Harold led the way, taking Bridget a few rods back down the road they had come, then plunging into the tree line and circling around the open ground under the cover of the woods. The branches sprayed them with water as they brushed past, but the canopy above offered some relief from the relentless drumming of the driving rain, which made the going slightly more pleasant. Harold moved like a fox or a wolf through the woods. His feet seemed to find the clearest path, and his passing seemed not to disturb a thing. No branches broken, no leaves kicked over. Bridget, in contrast, felt as if she was crashing along like a wounded bear, despite the solicitous help that Harold insisted on offering. It took them 20 minutes to work their way around the open ground. Occasionally their path would bring them close enough to the fields that they could see Tara and the camp, and the few of Owenolf's men who had revealed themselves. But mostly they were in the thick woods, lost in a maze of trees and bracken. And when they were, Bridget would become convinced that Harold was lost, only to have the tree line thin out and reveal that he was still following the edge of the fields, as if the way was marked with signs and arrows. It was tiring, dodging branches and catching herself as she stumbled, dragging the extra weight of her soaked clothing. And Bridget was about to suggest a rest when Harold stopped short and made a shushing sound, finger held to his lips. He gestured for her to follow, then turned and crept forward, parting the undergrowth with care, bending low as he advanced. Bridget did the same, moving to a place by Harald's side, carefully pushing aside the thin branches of the saplings at the edge of the wood. And then they were there, at the tree line, the open ground stretching away at their feet, the closest parts of the Irish camp. The tents and the banners and the men-at-arms were no more than 50 feet away. Bridget felt suddenly exposed, but she realized that they were still well hidden by the foliage, and even if anyone was looking, his sight would be much impeded by the merciless downpour. Besides, these are my people. These are Irishmen. They won't kill me or sell me as a slave, she reminded herself, knowing even as the thought came to her that it was not true. The Irish were at least as brutal to one another as the Vikings were to them. They stood in silence, looking out from their cover. Bridget's eyes went to the banners, wet and heavy, and hanging from poles driven into the ground near the largest of the tents. The most prominent of them looked brownish-grey, but she knew that could not be right. No one chose that sort of colour for his banner. A gust of wind rolled across the field, shaking the trees, dumping water on Bridget's head, and lifting the banner and holding it straight out. Bridget gasped from the deluge of water and the sight of the banner all at once. It was not grey, it was gold, the colour dulled by the soaking rain. Splayed across the gold field was a red eagle, its wings outstretched. She knew that flag, though she had not seen it in a long time, and she could not immediately place it. "You know?" Harald asked in a soft voice, nodding toward the distant camp. "I think," Bridget said. She pictured the banner, tried to imagine it dry and waving in the sunlight. And then she remembered. Rourke Mac Brain of Leaven. His wife had been ill. He had not come to her wedding. Her second wedding. She remembered him from her first. He was 10 or 15 years her senior, well-made, with a commanding presence, but not one that was overbearing. She remembered the flush of guilt she had felt when she caught herself admiring him on the very day of her wedding to another. He's of the family Udanyera of Leinster, she thought. What does Leinster want of Brega? But that was a foolish question, and she knew it. The crown of the 3 kingdoms was at Tara, the royal seat of Brega, and Rourke Mac Brain would want it as much as any of the nobles in Brega, Leinster, or Meeta. Taking the crown by force of arms, however, would not bestow on Rourke the authority over the kingdoms. Only the abbot of Glendalough could do that. But even if Rourke could not wear the crown, he likely had his eye on the throne of Tara, for he would never be averse to holding power over Brega as well as Leinster. Or perhaps he is looking for an alliance with the true heir to the throne of Tara and the crown of the 3 kingdoms. Bridget knew that her father had never considered Rourke Mac Brain one of those men intoxicated with power, eager to fight anyone if doing so might expand their kingdom. So why was he here? If Rourke had been willing to recognize Flann and Morrigan's authority, then he and his men would have likely been within the walls of Tara now, and not hunkered down in an armed camp outside. "You know Flag?" Harald prompted, and Bridget realized that she had been lost in her thoughts, caught in the labyrinth of this Irish struggle for power. "Oh, yes, I believe I do," she said, and in that instant she came to a decision. She straightened, took a step toward the open ground. She heard Harald draw a sharp breath. "Let us go and speak to them," she said over her shoulder, with no attempt to keep her voice low. Before Harald could object, or physically restrain her, which she thought him quite capable of doing, she stepped boldly out of the tree line and headed directly toward the camp. She heard the rustle of Harald coming after her, then his frantic whisper, "Stop! Wait!" But she did not look back or slow down in the least. At first, No one in Rourke MacBrain's camp seemed to notice. The few men who Bridget could see were standing, miserable and hunch-shouldered in the rain, looking out toward Tara or across the rolling fields toward Owenolf's band. She and Harold were no more than 20 feet away when one of the guards finally turned enough to notice her approach. She could see him visibly start and lower his spear in her direction and call something over his shoulder, which sent another guard scurrying away. Harold was still whispering something, his tone becoming increasingly frantic, but she did not bother to try and decipher the broken and heavily accented words. 10 feet from the wicked iron point of the guard's spear, Bridget stopped and drew herself up, mustering all the royal dignity she was able to in her soaked and filthy condition. "Is this the camp of Rourke MacBrain?" she demanded. The guard cocked his head at her, and then glanced over her shoulder at Harold, but her imperious tone and clear assumption of superiority had their intended effect. "Yes, ma'am, yes," the guard said, and then, recollecting his duty, added, "And who might you be? And what your business?" Bridget ignored the question. "Please inform your master Rourke that the Princess Bridget Neek Mull Sheknel is here and would speak with him." The guard, clearly impressed, made to comply without hesitation, but before he could even turn, the man who had first run off returned. "Lord Rourke says," he began, but the guard cut him off. "This here's the Princess Bridget Neek Mull Sheknel," he said, proud to possess such knowledge. "Oh," the other man said. "Well, pray, your Highness, would you follow me?" Bridget headed off after the guard, hoping that Harold would have the good sense not to follow, but knowing that he would not. They walked through rows of tents, flies strung from poles with fires struggling and smoking beneath them, toward the gold banner with the red eagle and the large marquee that rose up behind it. The tent seemed to glow from within, candles lit against the gloom of the day, and it held a promise of warmth and shelter which Bridget suddenly found unendurably alluring. She picked up her pace. She heard Harold do the same. At the door of the marquee, the guard stopped, lifted the flap, and called, "My lord, the Princess Bridget Neek Mull Sheknel." "Come, come." Bridget heard a voice, vaguely familiar, but not intimately so. She stepped through into the blessed dryness, and the warmth generated by the profusion of candles set around the interior. Rourke MacBrain was standing in the center of the space, a mail shirt over his tunic, which told Bridget right off that it was not a social function that brought him to Tara. "Dear Lord," he said as he saw her. He nodded to a servant, and the young man hurried over and put a blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you, my Lord Rourke," Bridget said with a little nod of her head. He was older than she remembered him, a bit of grey at the temples, which did his looks no harm. His face was a bit more lined, but again, the signs of being careworn did not detract from his physical gifts. Bridget pulled her eyes from Rourke, because she realized that there was someone else in the marquee, standing off to the side. His clothes were dark, and he had not moved or spoken, so she did not notice him at first. Now she looked, and drew in a breath. "Father Finian!" "Yes, my dear." The priest stepped closer to her. His presence alone filled her with a sense of peace and hope. "And you can't know how glad I am to see you here," he said, extending his hands, which she took. There was a shuffling behind her. Her throat cleared, and Bridget was surprised to realize that Harold was still there. She turned to him. He was just inside the door of the tent, his eyes wide as he looked around, his expression confused as he tried to grasp what was happening right in front of him. "Harold?" Bridget said. She pronounced the word slowly and clearly so he would understand. Her tone was kind, more kind than it had been in some time, but there was a finality to her words. "Thank you for taking me here," she said, "and now you may go." Chapter 40. I thought I felt how the Valkyrie's hands, dripping with sword rain, placed a bloody cap upon my thickly grown, straight-cut locks of hair. Gisli Surson's saga. That morning, with the first hints of dawn creeping in around the shuttered windows, Morrigan's maidservant, a clever girl named Moon, had shaken her out of sleep, and as she came awake, she knew something was wrong. Morrigan was in the habit of rising early, but not that early, and she generally woke of her own accord. "What is it?" she asked. Moon had brought a candle that cast a sphere of yellow light around her and Morrigan and the bed. "The men are up on the wall," Moon said. "Something is happening, ma'am. I know not what." Morrigan frowned. "Someone sent you?" "No, ma'am. Your brother and some of the others, the lead men, they were up on the wall, and there seemed to be something happening beyond the walls, but they did not say what. I thought you should know, ma'am." Morrigan nodded and swung her feet out of bed. "Smart girl, you were right to fetch me," she said. This was why she kept Moon close. Like Donal and Patrick, she was useful, and she understood how power was wielded at Tara. "Fetch my clothes." Moon set the candle down and was gone into the semi-dark of the room, then back with Morrigan's brat, which she arranged over her shoulders. She took up the candle and led the way through the darkened hall of the royal household, which they had reoccupied the week before. At the end of the hall, Morrigan pushed open the big oak door and stepped out into the morning air. It was not as early as she had thought, but the low, heavy clouds made the morning darker than it would normally be at that hour. Soon the rain would set in, she could see that, and then they would pay in full for the fine weather they had enjoyed over the past week. The sky had all the look of divine retribution about to be visited upon them, and she felt a twinge of apprehension as she walked quickly toward the main gate of Tara. Beside the gate, a ladder rested against the wall. In the grey light, she could see them, the outline of her brother, Flann, and a handful of others, standing on the top of the ring fort's chief defensive works. Something was going on, and Flann had not called her. That, too, made her uneasy. Flann was still angry about the trick they had played on the Northmen, even though it had worked out as well as Morrigan might have hoped. Better, in truth. They had rounded all the bastards up like so many sheep, and marched them into the great hall, which was now, and for the past few days had been, their prison. How they would ever get the stink out of the place, Morrigan did not know. It had worked very well indeed, with the one exception of Thorgrim's having escaped. Donal and Patrick had returned in the morning, and told her the tale of the night's hunting, how the dogs had accidentally cornered a bear or a wolf in the stand of trees. But Morrigan knew Thorgrim, knew the stories that were told about him, and the brothers could not hide their surprise when she made the sign of the cross and, wide-eyed, whispered, "Holy Mary, protect us." But Flann had not been so delighted. It was, by his lights, a dishonourable victory, a victory won through trickery rather than bloodshed. The fact that it had worked so well actually made Flann angrier still, or so Morrigan divined. Men, Morrigan thought, as she crossed the open ground. Men, and their honour and fighting. Such things were fine for them. They had victory, or they had death, and with the latter a hope of heaven. They did not think about the women left behind to be raped, the children to be sold into slavery. Men, and their damned, damned honour. She reached the foot of the ladder and climbed, and at the top she stepped onto the earthen wall. From there she looked off in the direction in which the others were gazing and pointing, and she could see, right off the focus of their attention, the irregular grey shapes and the spots of light might have been meaningless to many, but Morrigan recognized it immediately for what it was: tents, cooking fires, a camp. And though she could not see much detail in the dull light and the distance, she had no doubt it was an armed camp. They had come in the night, set up in the dark. Morrigan moved along the wall until she was standing at Flan's side. "Brother, who is this?" she asked. Flan looked over at her and then back at the new arrivals. He did not speak, but she knew he would. She would let him have his little victory. Let him make it clear he spoke when he felt like it. At length he did. "We're not sure. They arrived in the dark. We never even knew they were there until first light. They came from the north, so I do not think they are Vikings." For a minute they were silent, looking out over the fields growing more distinct in the gathering light. Then one of the men with Flan spoke. "Here, my lord." He pointed to a place somewhere between the wall and the distant camp. They could just make out a figure running across the field. "I sent out a man to see who this was," Flan explained. It was 5 minutes before the runner had come through the gate and climbed the ladder to the top of the wall. He was breathing hard, and Flan gave him a moment to collect himself. When his breathing had subsided to the point where he could speak, he did. "It's an armed camp, my Lord Flan. 250, 300 men at least, I should think. Horses, well equipped." The men and Morrigan considered this. Morrigan was aching to ask the obvious question, but she held her tongue. Finally, her brother asked it. "Do you know who they are?" "I do not. I could not find out, but I think I could make out their banner. It was tan or light brown, it seemed, and had a bird with wings spread. An eagle, perhaps." "Rock Mac Brain," Flan said. "Oh, you son of a whore," Morrigan thought. "Why don't you just mind your own affairs?" An hour later, the riders appeared. 5 men mounted on horseback, trotting at an easy pace across the open ground between the camp and Tara's front gate. 2 of them held aloft banners on poles, and as they drew near, Morrigan, who was still standing with Flan atop the wall, could clearly make out the gold field and red eagle, the colours of Rock Mac Brain from Leaven, scion of the Udonheda of Leinster. "This will be a delegation," Flan said to no one in particular. "I'd better go see what they want." He brushed past Morrigan and headed for the ladder, and Morrigan followed. But then Flan stopped and looked back at her, and they held one another's eyes, the silent words loud in their thoughts. Flan was angry still, and he had lost patience with Morrigan and her trickery. But this was not fighting he was going to now. It was talking, negotiation, and they both knew that Morrigan was the more formidable one in that arena. They looked at one another, and all that wordless debate flew between them, brother and sister, and then Flan turned, defeated, and headed for the ladder, with Morrigan following right behind. They would normally have welcomed the delegation into the great hall, the most impressive of all the rooms at Tara, but that place was crammed with angry Norsemen. So instead they met in one of the larger rooms of the royal household. The king's throne had been brought over so that Flan might be seated in regal style, and smaller chairs for the others were arranged in front of it. Morrigan stood just behind and to one side of Flan, her hand resting on the ornately carved back of the big oak chair. Rock Mac Brain did not come himself. The man he sent to head up the delegation was older than Rourke, in his late 40s perhaps, and appeared to be no one's fool. He bowed and said, "My Lord Flan, I am Brandon MacAiden. My Lord Rock Mac Brain sends his regards and—" "Does he?" Flan interrupted. "Sends his regards. An odd way to do it, arriving unannounced with an army in tow, setting up a camp just an arrow shot from my walls. Well done, brother, Morgan thought. Flann was taking the initiative, hoping to put this man off guard, though in truth he seemed not in the least flustered. My lord, Rock, regrets the manner in which he has arrived, Brendan continued, but he feared he might not be so welcome if he announced his intention of coming. Whether he is welcome or no remains to be seen. It will depend much on the reason for his coming. Flann gestured toward the seats in front of him, and the delegation sat. Yes, Brendan said, taking a seat with the others. His reason, indeed. It is thus. The Abbot of Glendalough has sent word to my Lord Rock that he would see the rightful heir seated on the throne of Tara. The Abbot of Glendalough? Flann demanded. What business is it of his? It is well known that the crown of the three kingdoms was sent to Tara. The abbot is commanded by God to see that it is used as it should be. Bridget has gone to him to see Rourke, Morgan thought. Why else would he concern himself with these affairs? Abbot of Glendalough, indeed. Perhaps she did not go to the heathens at all. And then Morgan had another thought. Finian. What part was he playing in all this? God may command the abbot as he wishes, Flann was saying now, but the abbot does not command at Tara, neither do the Udonhiera of Leinster. Brendan bowed his head, as if in acknowledgment of this truth. My Lord Rock understands that this would seem to be beyond his sphere, he began. But Morgan decided to take a chance and interrupted. Is Father Finian behind this? She asked, her tone sharp. That question did elicit a reaction from Brendan, just a trace of surprise, but enough for her to know that she was right. I don't believe I know a Father Finian, Brendan said, but the lie came too late, and Morgan continued, addressing her brother as if Brendan had not spoken, or indeed as if he was not even there. If Finian is behind this, Lord Flann, then that means Bridget is behind him. Morgan continued. The Lord knows what they promised Rock, but they have clearly enlisted him in their effort to remove you, the rightful king of Tara, from the throne. Is this true? Flann demanded of Brendan. Brendan cleared his throat and sat up straighter. I am commanded simply to tell you that my Lord Rock is here to enforce the wishes of the Abbot of Glendalough, and to see put in place the rightful heir to the throne of Tara. The peace of the three kingdoms and the safety of our people against the heathen invaders demand this. That is why it is of interest to him. The Abbot of Glendalough, Morgan said, stepping around from behind Flann's throne. You invoke his name much, sir. You must have some written command from him, something that spells out his wishes to Lord Rock and to my Lord Flann. May we see it? She held out her hand, knowing full well that he had no such thing. He would have revealed it by now if he had. Brendan, for the first time since their meeting, looked unsure of himself. The abbot sent no written word, he explained, his voice carrying less surety than it had before. His desires were related to us by a messenger, sent direct from Glendalough. Finian, Morgan thought. And on that, Flann took up the discussion, does Rourke expect us to fling open the gates and welcome him in? To stand aside and let Leinster determine who shall rule Brega? Brendan stood, no doubt sensing correctly that the impasse had been reached. The rest of the delegation stood as well. My Lord Rock does not wish for bloodshed, nor does the abbot. We would suggest that you do indeed open the gates and allow us, and all the parties concerned, to come to some sort of mutual agreement. Flann stood as well, putting as much aggression as he could behind the move, and when he spoke, his voice was loud, his anger palpable. There will be no agreement as long as that grasping villain will dare keep his army on the soil of Brega. You may tell your Lord Rock that we will not be cowed by his threats. He may fling his men against our walls as much as he wishes. He will find no quarter here, by God. If he wants bloodshed, sir, then he shall have it." With that, Flann turned his back to Brendan and stormed out of the room, a servant frantically pulling the door open for him so that he did not have to break stride. Brendan kept his eyes on Morrigan. He did not watch Flann exit. "Well," he said, as if sensing that Flann's word was not the last on any subject. "You have heard my Lord Flann's words, Brendan MacAiden. You may take them back to your master, and may God have mercy on us all." Brendan did not argue. He could see that they were done. He bowed, and the rest of his delegation bowed, and they turned and made for the door through which they had come. Morrigan remained motionless, alone in the room, staring at the door long after the men had gone. The whole thing had played out pretty much as she had imagined it would. Flann had done well. He had shown only strength and fearlessness, and that was a good message for Brendan to bring back to Rourke. But it did not change the underlying truth of the situation. If Rourke chose to take Tara by force, then he could. The walls and gate would not hold for long. For that matter, the people within the ring fort might be starved out in a matter of a week or so. If Rourke chose to lay siege to the town, rather than risk the lives of his men, the Rede Tuahe would most certainly not involve themselves in this affair. They would not pick sides, and if they did, they would likely go with Rourke, because Rourke had the stronger position. "We need an army. We need to deliver a wound to Rourke," she thought. But she knew that the men-at-arms at Tara were outnumbered 3-1. If they went beyond the gates of the ring fort, they would be butchered. And then she saw the spark of an idea. She caressed it, blew on it gently, let it flicker and grow and burst into life. "Yes," she thought, "yes, here is a notion." If it did not play out as she envisioned, then they were no worse off, and if it did, then 6 problems were solved with a single stroke. A faint smile played over her lips. The hardest part, she realized, would be making Flann see the wisdom that was so clear to her. Chapter 41. Let us make our drawn swords glitter, you who would stain wolf's teeth with blood. Egil Saga. Armbjorn Whitetooth stood on the raised dais of the great hall, the place that he reckoned was reserved for the king of Tara and his retinue. The hall was much as he had imagined, and this was the place that he had imagined as his place, above the heads of the rest, in the king's seat at the centre of the table. But of course there was no table, no seats, nothing but a big, empty room in which, far from being feasted, they were being held prisoner. 150 men, scattered over the packed dirt floor, gathered in little groups according to old friendships. It was dark, with only a little daylight sneaking in around the edges of barred shutters, and rendered the whitewashed wattle walls grey. The upper reaches of the ceiling, the heavy wooden beams, the tight thatch, were all but lost in the gloom. There had been a feast, of course, and Armbjorn had allowed himself to believe the Irish had gratefully served it up in tribute. So terrified were they of him. And that in turn had landed him and his men there, shuttered up in the great hall, prisoners, the most shameful of conditions, and all his earlier fantasies of ruling Tara and bedding Bridget served only to mock him now. They had been played for fools, him and all his men, and now they were stripped of their weapons, their freedom, and their manhood. All but Thorgrim, Thorgrim, Nightwolf. Thorgrim. Thorgrim, Arambjorn thought, the name coming to mind frequently and unbidden. It was certainly no coincidence that Thorgrim and his son, and the lunatic Stari, whom Thorgrim counted as a friend, were the only ones to have escaped. This had all been Thorgrim's doing. All this treachery. Arambjorn had figured that out once the effects of the poison had passed, once he realized that Thorgrim was not among the prisoners. It was Harald, Thorgrim's son, who had brought the traitorous bitch Bridget to him, with her tales of the riches to be had at Tara, and Harald was too dim-witted to think of such a plot on his own. He did not act without Thorgrim's explicit instructions. Damn him! May he end as carrion for crows and vultures, Arambjorn thought, as the frustration got the better of him. He had insulted Botley by putting Thorgrim in his place, just so that he might go into battle side by side with Thorgrim, and run a sword through him when the chance presented itself. Thus he would use Thorgrim to help him gain Tara, and free himself from being in Thorgrim's debt, all with a single thrust. And now see how it has turned out. Not everyone could see Thorgrim's part in this. For a day and a half, Rolleif, who had consumed a superhuman amount of the roast pork, was too sick to speak, and when he had partially recovered, and found himself a prisoner of the Irish, he was too furious to make a reasonable reply to anything. Indeed, he seemed to blame Arambjorn for their situation. Ingolf was sceptical as well. "Why would Thorgrim do this? What has he to gain?" he asked, when Arambjorn had laid out his suspicions. "He's in league with the Irish whore. Don't you see?" Arambjorn explained. "Which one? The one we brought with us from Duvlin, or the one who poisoned us?" "Both. I don't know. It is just clear to me this is his doing. He knew the one who poisoned us of old. Why is it that he alone, and his son, and the other one, Stari, they alone escaped?" "The gods favoured him," Ingolf suggested. "He was smarter than us. I don't know, but I don't see how any of this would have been in his favour. If I find that Thorgrim is befriended by the Irish, if they have done him honour, then I will find truth in your words. But for all we know, he and his son were killed by the Irish and fed to the dogs." Ingolf's words did nothing to allay Arambjorn's suspicions about Thorgrim, but they did convince him that Ingolf, too, was part of the plot in some way, and that he, like Thorgrim, must die once the chance presented itself. This he relayed to Botley Thorvaldsson, who was the only one of them whom he still trusted completely. And Botley made certain that word spread throughout the company of prisoners, word of Thorgrim's treachery, of how he had sold out Arambjorn's men for his own gain. It was a message that the men heard, and were inclined to believe. Surely it made more sense that they had been betrayed by one of their own, than that they had been played for fools by some Irish wench. If the latter was true, it might suggest that they were not as clever as the Irish, and this was a thought to be dismissed out of hand. For all of Arambjorn's insights into the circumstances of their imprisonment, however, there was not much that could be done as long as they remained locked up in the great hall. So Arambjorn, alone with Botley on the dais, made plans. "We will escape this prison, Botley," Arambjorn said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Either by tricking these Irish, or—" He got no further than that. A key turned in the lock of the small door to the side, the door through which food and drink was passed, though it was not above an hour since they had been given the tough bread and weak beer that constituted their breakfast. This was some other business. Heads turned at the sound. Some men stood and faced the door. A good turn of events, or bad. Either way, this promised to be a break in the unbearable monotony of the days past. Arembjorn, too, faced the door. He watched it swing open to reveal a pair of guards, well armed, spears held ready to impale any who might rush them. None of the Norsemen moved, so the guards took steps aside, and Morrigan passed between them. She cast an inquisitive look around the great hall, as if assessing the condition of the men inside, like a farmer looking over his herd. Finally, her eyes moved to the raised area on which Arembjorn stood. "Arembjorn!" she called out in her clear, strong voice. Once again, Arembjorn could not help but notice what a beauty she was, her long, dark hair tumbling around her shoulders, her strong, slim body, obvious even under the loose fabric of laine and brad. "Arembjorn, would you accompany me? I would have a word with you." A bit of a smile played over Arembjorn's lips. Morrigan, he imagined, had finally realized the great danger she had brought to all of Tara, trying to fool him, bringing him and his men within the walls of the ringfort. Now she would try to back her way out of the trap in which she had put herself. "Very well," he said, trying to sound as if she was interrupting some important business. He hopped down from the dais and strolled toward her. Morrigan's face remained unreadable, but he could see on the faces of the guards the frustration that his unhurried pace was causing. "That's good," he thought. "They should know I do not hurry for them." But once he was within arm's length of the door, one of the guards reached in and grabbed a handful of his tunic and jerked him through, while the other slammed the heavy oak door and locked it behind. Arembjorn found himself in the passage outside the great hall. There were 4 guards in all, with spears at the ready. Morrigan stood before him. She was a foot shorter than he was, at least, but with her posture and her air of confidence, she did not seem in the least diminutive. "Lord Arembjorn, first, please let me apologize for what we have done," Morrigan began, her words reinforcing what Arembjorn had already come to understand about her fears. "It was an unkind thing, true, but pray, try to see our position. An army of Northmen descending on us. We quite unable to defend against you. It is no secret what your people have done to other towns and monasteries in this country." Arembjorn nodded his head in gracious acknowledgment. "I understand, of course," he said. "It was Thorgrim who put you up to this. Is that not right?" "Thorgrim?" "Thorgrim Olsen, the one they call Nightwolf. I know that he put you up to this, that this treachery was his doing. It is no secret." Arembjorn saw the look of understanding sweep over Morrigan's face, and he knew that this thrust had found its mark. More confirmation that he was correct in his assessment of the situation. "Yes," Morrigan said. "Exactly so. Thorgrim was the one who came up with this entire scheme, to undermine you." "Of course. He's not nearly so clever as he thinks. Is he with you now, in Tara?" No, nothing of the sort," Morrigan said, shaking her head, her expression now distraught. "A man like that, he'll betray anyone. I should have known that. I should have spoken with you. Then I would have met with an honest man. Thorgrim has abandoned us and joined with our enemies. They are camped just outside our walls. We need you, Arembjorn. We need you and your men to join with us in battle, to defeat Thorgrim and the men with him, so that the riches of Tara will be ours." Arembjorn nodded, but in truth this was sounding a little less promising. "To defeat Thorgrim, you say?" "Yes," Morrigan said, her tone brightening now. "They are but 70 men or so with Thorgrim, but my men-at-arms are afraid to take them on. If you join with us, however, we will outnumber them 2 to 1. My men will fight if you will lead them, and then victory will be certain." This made sense to Arambjorn, but there was still one significant problem. "We have no weapons," he pointed out. "We lost them when—" he stammered, then stopped. They both knew perfectly well what had become of the Norsemen's weapons, but Arambjorn did not care to say it out loud. "We have your weapons," Morrigan said. "They will be returned, all of them, with our thanks and apologies." "You will return our weapons, just like that?" Arambjorn felt a little flame of suspicion kindling in his head. "You fooled us once, and I don't care to let it happen again." "We did what we had to do," Morrigan said. "I've told you before, the safety of my people, of Tara, is all I care about, and I will do what I have to do. And if that means fighting with the Fingal, then that is what I will do. I am not offering to give you your weapons, your freedom, for nothing. Fight with us, against Thorgrim, and those things will be yours." Arambjorn nodded. Put that way, Morrigan's offer seemed reasonable. Had she been trying to trick him, she would have offered anything. But here she was making it clear that her offer was good only if they joined in the fight against Thorgrim and his new band. That made the offer seem far less suspicious and, as it happened, far more tempting to Arambjorn. "I must discuss this with the lead men," Arambjorn said. "We do not have much time. Thorgrim and his men are at the gate. I will give you half an hour, and then I will come for your answer. You must let me know then." With that, Arambjorn was returned to the great hall in as rough a manner as he had been withdrawn. He recovered himself and called for Botley and Ingolf and Rolleif. They gathered on the dais, and Arambjorn explained the situation and Morrigan's offer.
"Lying bitch!" Rolleif exploded. "Are we to believe her again? Hasn't she played us for fools enough?"
"She explained why she did what she did," Arambjorn replied, "and I, for one, am satisfied with her explanation. As I suspected, this was mostly Thorgrim's doing. She wants revenge as much as we do. She offers us the chance."
"It is not clear to me just how Thorgrim is involved here," Ingolf said. "Did she tell you what part he played?"
"She didn't have to," Arambjorn said. "She told me Thorgrim was part of this, which I already knew and told you, and that is all we need to know." He hoped Ingolf would drop this line of questioning, because he realized when he tried to explain Thorgrim's part that he really did not know at all what it was, only that he had done something, and that their captivity had been the result.
"Here is the matter, boiled down," Botley said. "We stay in here, like swine ready for the slaughter, or we take Morrigan's offer and gain the chance for freedom. If she puts weapons in our hands, we cannot lose. Even if we die, it is a better death than that of prisoners or slaves."
Heads nodded at that sentiment, the first inarguably true thing any of them had said. If they were let out of their prison, they could die fighting someone, and such a death would certainly be preferable to rotting behind locked doors. 20 minutes later, Morrigan was back. 10 minutes after that, the Northmen marched from the great hall, free for the first time since the night they had feasted on Irish pork. It was raining, they discovered, as they left the confines of the hall and stepped out into the open ground of the ringfort. The sky was dark and brooding, and the rain was coming down in torrents. Wide puddles, their surfaces dancing and roiling in the downpour, were spread across the trampled ground. But the rain did not bother Arambjorn or his men. They were filthy and stinking after their sickness and captivity, and this fresh water from the gods, on a morning that was not overly cold, seemed more a blessing than a torment. They marched across the grounds in a loose file, flanked by a few dozen guards with lowered spears.
"I had thought we were supposed to be allies now,"
Rolleif growled. "Morrigan is being cautious, that's all," Armbjorn said. "Think of it from her side. We could easily overpower all the men-at-arms here at Tara, even without our weapons, and we have reason to do it. These precautions are insufficient, of course, but she must take them." At that Rolleif grunted, but said nothing. They came at last to the big oak gate, 15 feet in height, the main way in and out of Tara. It, too, was flanked with guards, and to one side a pile of swords, spears, mail shirts, battle-axes, all the weapons that had been taken from them when they had been taken captive after the feast. "Welcome, Lord Armbjorn." Armbjorn looked up, shielding his eyes against the driving rain. Standing on the wall, above the gate and a little to the side, was Morrigan, a cape around her shoulders, a hood pulled over her head. Beside her, in mail and a helmet, sword hanging at his side, stood the man she had introduced as her brother, Flann. Armbjorn wondered if he was indeed a brother to her. "Morrigan," Armbjorn called back, "you have been true to your word." "Of course I have," she called back. "You see your weapons there. Pray, let every man take what is his and arm himself. Then we go forth, Fingal and Irish, and we will fight these enemies of ours." Armbjorn turned to give the order, but the men were already swarming over the pile of weapons, pulling mail shirts over their shoulders, strapping sword belts around their waists, settling helmets on their heads. Behind them, the men-at-arms of Tara formed up, their lines more neatly dressed than the Vikings were wont to be. They were ready to go, and a moment later Armbjorn's men were as well. "We will open the gates," Morrigan called from the wall above, and Armbjorn looked up again. "But the enemy is hard by, and we do not wish to keep them open long. My brother instructs me to tell you that you men, you Fingal, will sally forth, and the men-at-arms of Tara are behind you." She pointed to a place beyond the walls, lost to Armbjorn's sight. "We can see the enemy. They are still in camp. They have not taken the field. You will have time enough to form up, and then you can sweep them away." Armbjorn pulled his sword from its sheath and raised it in a dramatic gesture. "We are ready to fight, and we are ready to kill or to die, by the will of Odin, All-Father," he shouted. "By the will of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," Morrigan shouted back, to Armbjorn's discomfort. But before he could even think of anything to say, the bar was lifted from its brackets, and the big oak gate swung ponderously open, revealing the fields and the distant wood that Armbjorn remembered. He turned, raised his sword higher. "You men, follow me, to victory or death." He stepped forward, moving faster with each stride, and the host of Northmen flowed behind him. He could see smiles on their faces, faces that had been twisted with fury just hours before. They were free, and they had weapons in their hands, and that was the most that any of their kind might desire. They poured through the gate, and onto the well-trod ground beyond, the 150 or so men under Armbjorn's command. He stepped aside, and with his sword directed them to form up to the north of the open gate. Behind them, 50 or 60 feet behind, was the head of the column of Irishmen from Tara. Armbjorn smiled to himself. Those Irish, with all their spears and mail and helmets, were not as eager as the Northmen to get into the fight. They were not rushing forward as he and his men had done, but marching at a more slow and irregular pace. "I will send them in first," Armbjorn thought. Why throw away the lives of his men, men who would be the most effective on the battlefield? He would order the men-at-arms in first, to take the shock of the attack, and then his men would sweep in and finish the enemy off. He turned to wait for the men-at-arms to come through the gate, so that he could direct them to where he wanted them. The Irish were still within the ring fort, 10 feet from the gate, and then he heard Flann shout something, and to Arembjorn's surprise they came suddenly to a stop.
"Get out here, you cowardly bastards!"
Arembjorn shouted, but he had not even completed the sentence before the ponderous gates swung shut again, and he heard the sound of the bar dropping in place. Chapter 42. You battle windswept warriors, I wish you'd suffer loss of giants' laughter and good fame both. The Saga of the Confederates. The drumming of the rain on the roof of the marquee made it hard to hear the hushed conversation. It also made Father Finian grateful to not be plodding along some miserable excuse for a road, or huddled in some peasant's pathetic, leaky hut. Rourke Mac-Brain's tent was roomier, better furnished and more comfortable than the homes of many of the poor farmers with whom he had stayed in his travels. "My only wish is to bring stability to Brega," Bridget was explaining. "My father longed for the crown of the 3 kingdoms, but I am not so eager to wear it, until we are at peace within our own kingdom. I don't see how we can hope to unite the 3 and defeat the Fingal." Rourke, who was seated across the small table from Bridget, nodded in agreement. The 3 of them, Rourke, Bridget, and Finian, were the only occupants of the marquee. The servants had been sent away. Outside, 2 guards flanked the entryway, visible whenever the canvas that covered the door flogged in the wind. This has the blessings of God, Finian thought. It was he, Finian, who had arranged for Rourke Mac-Brain and his troops to be here. But God had delivered up Bridget just when she was needed. Finian had been staggering in the dark, feeling his way, unsure if any of what he was doing was right. And then, like Abraham's ram in the thicket, Bridget had appeared. The sense of relief he felt was like nothing he had experienced before.
"As long as Flann sits on the throne, there will be no peace in Brega," Rourke said. "The Ree Tuatha will not rally to him, and soon they will be fighting one another. And Flann made it clear to Brendan MacAiden that he would not willingly give the throne up."
"When I am on the throne, secure on the throne, then the Ree Tuatha will come together," Bridget said. "And then I can begin to strengthen the alliance with the Ewe Dunhara of Leinster." Something in the way she said that pulled Finian from his musings. He looked over at her, but she was not looking at him. She was looking at Rourke Mac-Brain, and Rourke was looking at her in a way that suggested to Finian something deeper going on. There were undercurrents in their talk that went beyond simply discussing who would rule what. He was just wondering if he should excuse himself when a voice, loud and urgent, ended the discussion. "My Lord Rourke, something is happening at Tara." Rourke was out of his seat and out of the marquee before Finian and Bridget had even quite understood the implications of this. They both leapt to their feet, but Finian put a hand on Bridget's arm. "One moment," he said. He grabbed a cloak that was tossed onto Rourke's camp bed and draped it over her shoulders, pulling the hood up over her head. "I am sure my Lord Rourke would not mind," he said, and the 2 of them ducked out of the tent and into the hard rain, and what appeared to be total chaos. Men were rushing in every direction, snatching up swords, spears, and shields, fitting helmets on their heads. "To arms! To arms!" they could hear someone cry, and the cry was taken up around the camp, as men stumbled to grab their weapons and stand ready for action. They found Rourke beyond the tents, looking out over the long stretch of open ground between them and the ring fort. He was flanked by Brendan MacAiden and a few of his senior men, and they were talking in low voices and pointing here and there, seemingly oblivious to the madness behind them. "Princess Bridget, Father Finian, pray join us," Rourke called, welcoming them in among the others. "See here," he pointed toward Tara. "Men have come out. Do you see them? Before the gate." Finian squinted through the rain. He saw them at last. Quite a few men, more than 100 certainly. Distance and weather made it hard to see, but it appeared that they wore helmets and mail, or most did, the armor shining dull grey in the rain and low clouds. Finian could see spots of colour, which he guessed were painted shields. "Are they men from Tara?" he asked. "I would imagine so," Rourke said. "Though why they have left the safety of the ring fort and taken the field, I can't imagine. I would not, if I was in Flan's position, and I didn't think he would. That's why we weren't ready for this." They may not have been ready a few minutes before, but they were nearly so now, the men forming up behind and to either side of Rourke and the other lead men. Rourke's men-at-arms were not a bunch of farmers filling out their military obligations to their lord. They were professionals, and it showed. "What will you do, my Lord Rourke?" Bridget said, "if I may make so bold as to ask." "I'm not entirely sure," Rourke said. His words were slow and measured, as if he was working out his options as he spoke. "Once we're formed up, we'll advance into the open, get some fighting room. But I won't attack them. I'll let them make the first move, so I can see what they have in mind. I'm tempted to think they've made a terrible blunder, but I know Flan better than that. There's something acting here that I have yet to see." Finian felt his stomach knot up. He had hoped that this might all be accomplished without bloodshed. Both he and Rourke had thought the show of force would be enough to make Flan and Morrigan see the benefits of a negotiated peace, but now it looked as if they meant to fight, and it would be a bloody affair if they did, and that in turn meant he had precious little chance to make anyone see reason. Once steel met steel, that chance would be gone for good. "They're making a shield wall," Brendan MacAden said. In the distance, Finian could see the men rushing here and there, organizing themselves, moving from an amorphous cluster into a line, an unbroken line with shields held chest-high, dull-coloured dots against the brown walls of Tara. "Form our men up," Rourke called, loud but calm. There was no edge of excitement or alarm in his voice. He might have been calling across a yard for his groom to bring his horse, but behind them the men-at-arms fell into a line of their own, ready to counter any move the enemy might make. Finian was impressed, and heartbroken all at once. Irish fighting Irish. It was not right, and no wonder that the Northmen had so easy a time setting themselves up in that country. It made him ill. He turned his eyes from the men before Tara and swept the field, and was surprised to see a lone figure, one man, walking across the open ground. No one else seemed to have noticed him, or if they did not think he was worthy of comment. One man, not even walking so much as staggering, seemingly oblivious to the great machinations around him. And then Finian realized who he was. It was the young Norseman who had escorted Bridget Nickmore Sheknell to Rourke's camp. Now I wonder what he's about, Finian thought. Arambjorn felt the panic rising like a fast-moving tide, and he struggled to keep above it. It was not fear of the enemy, or the possibility of injury or death. It was fear that Morrigan had once again played him for a fool. That he did not think he could endure.
"What by the name of Thor is the meaning of this?"
Rolleif the Stout roared out as the big door shut behind them. It was the very same question that was shrieking in Arambjorn's brain. The buzz of conversation, the talk of the confused men around him grew louder, louder even than the rain drumming on Arambjorn's helmet, louder than the screaming questions in his head. He wanted to tell them all to shut their mouths, but he did not dare because he was afraid they would not listen.
"There! Look!"
Ingolf called, and pointed downhill and across the wide expanse of open, grassy field. There was a camp in the distance, about 3/4 of a mile off, the camp that Morrigan had been pointing toward. Presumably, that was the enemy with whom Thorgrim had joined up. Then, suddenly, Armbjorn was struck by the truth, coming like a cowardly punch from the blind side. "Oh, you cunning bitch," he thought. Then, speaking loud so the others could hear over the driving rain, he said, "This is what the Irish are about. They know we'll do anything to have our revenge on Thorgrim and those other traitors, so they've sent us out alone to fight their battle for them." He was pleased with those words, the sound of them, so he continued on in his most inspirational tone. "Very well, then. If they won't fight like men, then I say we kill them all those yonder with Thorgrim, and then we come back and kill every one of the miserable lying bastards at Tara as well." He had expected a rousing cheer to follow this bold statement, but he received only bewildered looks. To Armbjorn's further discomfort, though not his surprise, Rolleif was the first to speak, prefacing his remarks with a great clearing of his throat, followed by a great glob of spit held in the direction of the distant camp. "Thorgrim!" he roared, which pretty much seemed the only volume at which he was capable of speaking. "No one but you cares a turd about Thorgrim. How do you even know he is over there? Who told you that?" Armbjorn did not answer, because he realized how stupid the answer would make him appear. Unfortunately, the truth was not hard to guess, and Rolleif did, and guessed correctly. "By Odin's one festering eye," he roared. "Was it that Irish bitch, Morrigan? Thor's hammer! Is there anything she could say that you wouldn't believe? If she told you she could squat down and shit silver ingots, you'd stand there with your hands under her ass." Armbjorn could feel his face flush, and flailed around looking for a suitable reply, but there was none at hand. Happily, Ingolf saved him. "Look there!" he cried. "They are going to arms!" All eyes turned from Armbjorn and Rolleif's to the distant camp, where the men seemed to be racing around like ants on an overturned hill. There was something rushed and disorderly about their actions, as if they had been taken by surprise, and it was no wonder if they had been. Whoever they were, if they had come to fight, they probably did not think the men at Tara would leave a perfectly intact ring fort and meet them on the open ground. Armbjorn knew that he certainly would not have done so, given a choice. "It appears they are well armed and their numbers are great," Ingolf continued. "We have no dog in this fight. We have our weapons, we have our freedom. Our ships are likely still where we left them. Let the Irish kill the Irish, I say, and let us return to Duvlin." This met with considerable approval among the others, heads nodding, voices murmuring assent. Armbjorn pressed his lips together, desperate as he was to do so. He did not dare order them to prepare to attack the enemy across the field. He was all but certain he would be ignored, and that would be more humiliation than he could endure. "Thorgrim!" "We can't just turn our backs and walk away," Rolleif said, giving Armbjorn a faint glimpse of hope, until the big man added, "If they do attack, and we're unprepared, they'll murder us all. We need to form a shield wall, and back away across the field. Keep our faces and our shields toward the enemy as we retreat." This, too, was met with general agreement. No orders were given or needed. The Norsemen knew well how to form a shield wall, and they did so, quick and neat. Armbjorn could see the effect that the move had on the enemy in the far camp. The men who had been rushing chaotically about tumbled into place, making a formidable line of troops, mail-clad, helmeted, stretching from one end of the camp to another. In numbers and equipment and discipline, they made the Vikings look weak and puny.
"Very well,"
Rollev shouted.
"Stand ready to move back. Nice and easy. We'll be ready for these bastards if they charge. But if they stay put, it's back to the ships for us."
All eyes were locked on the distant men-at-arms, waiting for them to make a move, to roll forward and charge the shield wall and turn the standoff into a bloody fray. All but Arembjorn. Something had caught his eye, and he half-turned and looked across the field. Right in line with the flank of the shield wall, a single man, walking slowly along, as if he was out for a stroll, except that he seemed to be all but staggering as he plodded through the driving rain. Who by Loki could that be? Arembjorn wondered. The man looked like he might be drunk. Indeed, he would have to be wandering around in the open like that, with two armies facing off, and him seeming to not even notice. There was something familiar about him, his size and shape, and the way he moved. Arembjorn squinted through the rain, and then it hit him. Harald? He thought. Harald Thorgrimsson? They had slipped back into their familiar roles as easily as pulling on a worn pair of shoes. Owenolf loud, commanding, and outrageous. Thorgrim doing the actual leading, making the decisions that were really Owenolf's to make, when Owenolf could not be bothered to make them. It was not an arrangement that was meant to fool anyone, and it didn't. It was simply the most pragmatic division of labor, each man acting as his strengths dictated. Thorgrim did not want their presence revealed. He understood that surprise was the most precious of weapons, and like so many precious things, once it was lost, it could not be had again. So, by his command, only he and Owenolf and a few others stepped from the tree line to the place where the road ran out of the woods, and the ground opened up and rolled away to the walls of Tara, standing proud on the crest of its hill. There was little chance that the small knot of men would be seen from as far away as the ring fort, or the cluster of tents at the other end of the open ground. But even still, they hung toward the edge of the wood, standing in the bracken that lined the road, lost against the trees behind them. He had meant for the rest of the men to remain back and out of sight, but that was as likely to happen as the tide was to stop flowing at his command. So, like the tide, the men had inexorably crept forward, inching closer, seeping into the open places at the edge of the trees. But they knew what Thorgrim wanted, and they kept hidden by the arboreal cover, never exposing themselves as they maneuvered to a place where they could see what was going on. And since they did not threaten to ruin the gift of surprise, Thorgrim did not try to order them back. "See here," he said, pointing toward the ring fort. Across the distance, Thorgrim could see some movement, which he interpreted as the big oak door swinging open, and a moment later, men emerging, marching out in something akin to a military fashion, but not so disciplined as good and experienced troops would be.
"What do you make of them?"
Owenolf asked.
"I can make out little at this distance,"
Thorgrim said.
"Ha! Your eyes dim with your advancing age, Thorgrim Nightwolf,"
Owenolf said. Thorgrim smiled. He knew that Owenolf, his senior by nearly 2 decades, would reckon himself lucky if he could distinguish the fort from the hill on which it sat. Instead of pointing that out, however, he turned to Starry Deathless, who was with them in the bracken.
"Starry, what do you make of this?"
All of Starry's senses, hearing, sight, touch, smell, seemed preternaturally acute. He took a step forward and held his hand up to his forehead to shield his eyes from the rain, the way someone who did not live in Ireland might shield his eyes from the sun. "Armed men," Starry said at last. "More than 100, sure, but I don't think they're Irish. Their armour, shields, the way they organized themselves. They look more like Norsemen. He swivelled and looked off in the other direction. Whoever they are, they have the attention of the men in that camp. Look at them, racing around like chickens when a fox is among them. Starry found that all very amusing, though Thorgrim could not really see anything in the distant camp beyond the suggestion of movement, or at Tara's gate, the shuffling of the men clustered there. For some time no one spoke as they watched the two distant armies and waited to see what would happen, to see who would do what. It seemed to be a standoff, the two forces holding each other in check, neither one willing or able to make a move. It had a brittle feeling, like standing on new frozen ice, knowing it might break underfoot at any second. Who are they? Thorgrim wondered, looking at the men who had just come out of Tara. If not Irish, then who? If they were Norsemen, then the most likely answer was that they were Arembjorn's men. But he could not imagine why Morrigan would go to the trouble of poisoning them all and taking them prisoner, just to hand them back their weapons and let them go. Something to do with this armed camp? He wondered. Might Arembjorn have made a pact with Morrigan? Freedom for him and his men in exchange for fighting this new host? That made sense. Thorgrim could well picture Arembjorn's desperate negotiations to free himself from an Irish prison. There was very little he would not promise, Thorgrim guessed.
"Now what?"
Olaf asked, pointing toward Tara. "They are forming a shield wall," Starry said. Thorgrim could see they were moving again, the cluster of men at the gate. But as to their forming a shield wall, he would have to take Starry's word on that. He could not make out that sort of detail.
"Only the Irish could take a simple thing like a battle and turn it into such a damnable mess,"
Olaf roared.
"What by Thor's arse are they doing? And what are we going to do about it?"
"We'll know more once Harold and Bridget are back," Thorgrim said. "But this looks like their fight. No business of ours." There were two things working on Thorgrim now. The first was that he could see the chance for plunder had dropped off precipitously with the appearance of not one, but two armies. The second was the realization that the ship in which Olaf had come was in fact his ship, taken by him from the Danes. He had a ship, and that meant he now had the means of returning to Vik, without putting himself in debt to some whore's bastard like Arembjorn.
"So where is the boy?"
Olaf demanded.
"Been gone a long time. I hope he and his princess didn't stop to rut like wild boars in the woods. He's my grandson, you know. If that's what they're about, we might be hours waiting for his return."
Olaf's voice was like the rain, a near constant sound and nearly devoid of meaning. So, like the rain, Thorgrim hardly even heard it after a while. His eyes ran over the storm-swept field, from the ring fort to the camp, trying to imagine what the next move would be. Whatever it was, he did not think it would involve them. Once Harald was back, they would return to the river, to his ship. It was then that Thorgrim saw the man walking toward them, far off but headed in their direction. He was walking slowly, with no apparent purpose, not strolling so much as staggering, as if he might have been drinking. He was still fairly far off, and the rain made it more difficult to see, but there was something very familiar about his shape and the way he moved. "Starry," Thorgrim said. "Yes, it's him. Harald? Harald Broadarm, your son. Yes, that's him. He's alone." Thorgrim nodded. Alone. That spoke volumes. And then another thought occurred to him. "Is he wounded?" Starry shielded his eyes, and for a moment did not speak. "I can't see that he is," he said at last. but I can't see that he isn't. He's walking along fully exposed in the face of 2 armies, and doesn't seem too concerned.
I'm going after him,
Thorgrim said. I'm going with you, Starry said.
No,
Thorgrim said.
The whole thing hangs in the balance. If we tip it too far, it will all go.
2 will not tip it. More will, but not 2. Thorgrim considered this. 2 might tip it, or they might not. But Starry was a good man to have when he could be kept in control. What's more, if Harald had to be carried back across the field, Thorgrim was not at all certain he could manage by himself.
Very well, let's go, he said,
and the 2 of them stepped from the brush, stepped into the ankle-high grass, and headed off across the green, green fields and through the driving Irish rain. Harald was walking, because that was what his legs seemed to be doing, though not through any conscious decision that he had made. Each step appeared to be taking him back to the place from which he had come, but he was not really sure, and certainly did not care. He did not care about any of it. There really was no place he wanted to be. And now you may go. That was what she had said. And now you may go. He heard the words sounding over and over in his mind, like the constant peal of a bell. Standing in the tent, free of the rain for the first time in hours, the candlelight had played off her wet skin. Her clothes clung to her body, which was still lithe and strong, though the soaked fabric, tight over her belly, made her condition more obvious than it had ever been. She had that haughty look that she could get. It made her more beautiful than ever. And now you may go, as if he was some servant, some stable hand to be dismissed. He walked along. He heard her voice. "You are carrying our child," he shouted into the rain, but his words came out as more of a protracted groan than as real communication. Harald had no idea whose tent they had been in, but clearly Bridget did. Her words had stunned him like a club to the side of the head. If they had not, if he had been able to think, he would have pulled his sword from its sheath and killed them all, save for Bridget. Killed them all and taken Bridget back to where she belonged. He would have killed them, or he would have died in the attempt. Instead, he had been so dumbfounded by her casual dismissal that he could do nothing but obey. He was halfway back to his own people before it dawned on him what he should have done. "How could you do this?" he cried. The depth of his betrayal was more than he could wrap his mind around. He thought of those times when they had sailed out of sight of land, when he had looked down into the sea below the ship and wondered how many miles deep the water ran. It gave him an unsettled feeling, bordering on panic, to think of it. This feeling was akin, but now he had no ship below him. Now he was sinking down, down into the darkness. He was pretty sure that he was crying, but with the rain he could not tell, which was something of a blessing. Water ran down his face, into his eyes, which were not really focused anyway, so at first he did not see the 2 men moving toward him. When he did, he stopped in his tracks and blinked the rain away. He reached for the hilt of his sword, but he realized he did not have the will or the strength to even defend himself, so he let his hand drop to his side once again. They drew nearer, and Harald could see there was something undeniably familiar about them. He wiped more rain from his eyes and watched them approach, and then he recognized them. Father! Starry! Of course, he thought. He had been walking back to them, back to his people, without even thinking about it. The sight of the 2 men coming for him filled him with hope and comfort, like stepping out of a cold night into a home with a fire blazing. That was what his father had always meant to him. He was right. The realization dawned on Harald about Bridget, about all of it. He was right. And with that thought, all of the good feelings were gone, and in their place, humiliation, despair. He, Harald Thorgrimsson, Harald Broadarm, had been so certain. He had learned to speak the Irish language. He had insisted he did not want to return to Vik, that his new life was in Ireland. He had defied his father on that point, had actually fought with him. He had envisioned himself on the throne of Tara, and Thorgrim had been right all along. It was more than Harald could stand. No, 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 he thought. His father would not gloat or hold it over him, but that would make it worse. In its own way, his grandfather would laugh. He could hear it. No, he could not stand it, any of it. He would do what he should have done. He would take Bridget back, or he would die in the attempt. Now, of course, the second option was all but certain, but that was no matter. He could not go back to his people, not after having been played for such a fool. His father and Starry were close enough now that he could see them clearly. His father was waving, and through the constant drum of the rain he could hear him calling his name. Harald felt his determination wavering, but he clenched his teeth and forced himself to recall the agony he had been feeling an instant before. His hand reached across his waist, and his fingers wrapped around the familiar grip of his sword. He pulled the blade from its sheath, the weapon nicely balanced in his hand. "I have never named you," he thought, his eyes running over the long, double-edged blade. He had often cast around for a good name, but none had ever come to him. Vengeance Seeker, he thought. Yes, that's good. Vengeance Seeker. He looked at the sword. "You shall be Vengeance Seeker for as long as we are together," he said. "But I don't think it will be long. Not on this earth." With that, he turned and faced the camp from which he had come. He could see the soldiers standing in a loose line, not a shield wall, but something like. He started walking toward them, his pace purposeful and determined now. He moved faster. The walk became a jog, then a flat-out run. He held Vengeance Seeker over his head. A battle cry formed in his chest, and then burst from his mouth. A wild, undulating howl of pure, mindless bloodlust. It echoed around the field as he plunged, single-handed, into the fight. Chapter 43. In fury we fought battles. Fire swept through men's homes. We made bloody bodies slump dead by city gates. Egil Saga. Thorgrim and Starry stopped in their tracks, drawn up short by Harald's utterly unexpected move. "What, by Thor's hammer, does he think he's doing?" Thorgrim asked. For a moment they just watched him, as his pace increased, as he raised his sword above his head, and shouting out across the field. "What, by the gods?" Thorgrim said. He looked over at Starry, but Starry's eyes were fixed on Harald, and he was rubbing the arrowhead hanging around his neck. He was grinning. "He's taking the fight to the enemy," Starry said. "None of us old women standing around would do it, but he will." "The enemy?" Thorgrim said, nodding toward the camp. "We don't even know who they are. Anyway, he can't fight them all, not all by himself. What do we do now?" Starry turned his gaze from Harald and met Thorgrim's eyes. He had that crazed look that Thorgrim had seen before, when there was fighting to be done, and Starry ready to do it. "Thorgrim Nightwolf has to ask this," he said. "What to do? We join him." With that, Starry dropped the arrowhead, pulled his short sword from its sheath, his battle-axe from his belt, and leapt forward, bolting like a startled deer, going from dead still to a flat-out run in the blink of an eye. And not just running and waving his weapons and howling like the mad berserker he was. Thorgrim felt suddenly very alone, his friend and his son racing off to join a battle that had not yet begun, his men back at the tree line, and himself standing alone in the middle of the open ground, the rain pouring down. For a second, no more, he looked back and forth, lost in indecision. Then, with a howl of disgust with himself mainly, he pulled his sword and turned to the men in the woods behind him. "To arms! To arms! Follow me! Rally to me!" he shouted, as loud as his formidable voice could shout. "To me!" The men came out of the trees like a breaking wave. One moment there was nothing, just the still and motionless woods. And then the Vikings burst, screaming from the trees, weapons raised, cresting and roiling and charging forward. Thorgrim waited 1 second, 2 seconds, until he was sure they were all on the move, that their momentum would carry them across the length of open ground without his having to urge them on. And when he was satisfied that they were moving forward, that they would join in the fight as quickly as they humanly could, he turned and raised Irontooth and ran after Harald and Starry, and the distant enemy he did not even know. Rourke MacBrain saw them first. The others, Brendan MacAiden, his officers, Bridget, were looking toward Tara, when Rourke noticed the movement to their right. "Here they come," he said. "Bloody fools!" In that distance, the better part of a mile away, he could not make out much in the way of detail, but the sight of a horde of men making a disordered attack was unmistakable. They came rushing out from what had been the effective cover of the trees. Rourke had not even known they were there, but they had tossed that advantage away. Even from Norsemen he might have expected a more orderly approach, a shield wall, or what they called a swine array. But this was just a headlong rush. Suicide, really. "Is this a reason to be concerned?" Bridget asked. She did not sound very concerned. "No, I think not," Rourke said. "It was clever of them, hiding the right wing of their force in the trees. Might have been put to good effect. They would have done well to make an approach through the woods, the way that young Northman brought you here. Never saw you coming. If they'd done that, and timed their attack well, they might have had our right flank, rolled it right up. As it is, they will exhaust themselves running across the field. And we're not just forewarned. We practically have time for a nap before they get here." The others grunted with amusement at that. "These fellows here," Brendan said, pointing toward Tara and taking up the narrative for his lord, "will make an attack as well. Hope to catch us between two armies, as it were." "They will catch you between two armies, will they not?" Finian asked. "After all, they have two armies, and you but one." "We'll divide our force, left wing and right wing. We've men enough, and these are only heathens here," Rourke said, "or so it appears. We'll advance a few 100 yards and meet them on the field. No need to fight with our asses resting on the camp." He said that for the benefit of Bridget and Father Finian. He had no need to explain his thinking to Brendan MacAiden and his other officers. They were skilled enough, and they had all fought together long enough, that such elementary orders were unnecessary. Indeed, Rourke was still explaining the situation when Brendan and the others made quick bows in his direction, then hurried off to form the men up. "So who are you?" Rourke wondered. These men coming from the woods. They were the Fingal who had accompanied Bridget from Duvlin, or so she said. But what of the men who had come through Tara's gate? They seemed to be working with Bridget's men, or they would have retreated in the face of his army. Did Morrigan have her own Fingal army? Was Bridget playing a double game here? Rourke shook his head. "Father Finian," he said, Why does everything in Ireland have to be so damnably complicated? A shield wall was meant as a stationary defence, or a line moving forward. It was not intended as a formation for retreat, which is why the men under Arembjorn's command had covered no more than 20 yards, when the others burst from the woods, 3/4 of a mile away, coming from the exact direction in which Arembjorn's men were going. Arembjorn did not even notice them, until Rolleif the Stout bellowed, "Now who's this? By the gods, these people are dropping out of the sky!" Arembjorn turned. He saw 100 or so men, emerging from the woods on a run, following Harald Thorgrimsson, who was now running back in the direction in which he had come. Arembjorn frowned and shook his head, and tried to imagine what all this could mean. Who were these men? Was Thorgrim with them, or in that distant camp, or nowhere at all nearby? Rolleif was shouting again. "The gods don't think much of our retreating, and come to think on it, neither do I." "See here, Arembjorn," Ingolf said. Arembjorn pulled his eyes from this new host, and looked where Ingolf was pointing with his sword. A moment before, the men-at-arms in the distant camp had been standing in a loose and undisciplined line, taking little interest in Arembjorn's retrograde motion, but they were taking interest now. Down the length of the hill they could see the armed men forming in 2 divisions, one to meet the threat from the men from the woods, one to advance against Arembjorn's shield wall. "Those men, they must think these fellows who've come from the wood are part of our force," Arembjorn said. "Of course they think that, you godforsaken idiot!" Rolleif shouted. "Very well then, Rolleif, who is so wise?" called Botle Thorvaldsson, who was standing at Arembjorn's side and pointing toward the men from the woodline. "Who are these men?" "I don't know. How by Thor's arse should I know? Ingolf, do you know?" Ingolf shook his head. "I don't know, and I don't much care right now. These men-at-arms yonder are making ready to attack. We can either turn and flee back to the ships like a bunch of girls, or we can advance like men. What will it be?" The rest apparently felt as Rolleif did, that they were done with retreating, and their fighting spirit was bolstered by the sight of the 100 or so screaming Northmen on their left flank, now a half a mile away and racing headlong for the enemy. A cheer rippled along the line and built in strength. Swords were held high or beaten against shields. Cheers turned into battle shouts, and with never an order given, the shield wall, which had stopped in its retreat, now rolled forward, down the long hill, down at the enemy advancing toward them. Thorgrim's left foot snagged in some imperfection hidden by the grass. He stumbled for a few steps, caught himself before he fell, and ran on. He had nearly gone down, and worse, he realized that he had nearly allowed himself to go down. His chest was burning. His legs were aching. His breath was coming in gasps. He actually longed to stumble and collapse into the soft green grass, to lay motionless in the rain, to stop, just stop. He staggered on for a few more yards, and then he did stop, because he could not physically go any further. The old wound in his side throbbed, but it was too far healed now to open up again, without significant help. He bent nearly double, hands on his knees, gasping. He looked up. Harold and Starry had been drawing away from him since he had first gone after them. He had envisioned catching up with them, ordering them to stop, making them join the others. They would be slaughtered if they charged the enemy's line, just the 2 of them. But he soon realized that he could not catch them, and then he realized he could not even run all the way across the open ground. There had been a time, a decade or so earlier, that he would have kept up with them and likely beaten them. But those days were gone. So he had called out for them to stop. But by then he was so winded that he could not make his voice heard over the rain. And then he was done. He was still heaving for breath when he straightened, and turned to see where the others were. He had started with a lead of 1/4 mile on them, but now they were only a few dozen yards behind, and behind them, quite far behind. Owenolf the Restless was stumbling and staggering after. At least I am not the most pathetic old man here, Thorgrim thought. He straightened, and as the men grew closer, he held up his hands to stop them. He could not prevent Harald and Starri from making their death run, but he could prevent these men from being butchered for want of discipline, and maybe they could reach Harald and Starri in time. "Swineray!" he shouted, his words coming out more like a gasp than the powerful command he was trying for. "I'll take the lead. Form up on me." He ran his eyes over them, men he did not really know, until he found the one he was looking for. He was more bear than man, over 6 feet in height, and broad and stable as an old oak. His sword was like a toy in his hand, his shield like a dinner plate. "You there, what's your name?" "Goddy." "Goddy, with me. The rest of you get in order, quickly now." The Swineray, Odin's arrow, was designed to break shield walls. 2 men took the lead, with 3 behind them, and then 4, and then 5, creating a great human arrowhead that could break through the wall of interlocking shields and reduce the fight to a massive brawl, to the advantage of the Viking horde. "Thorgrim, take my shield!" One of the men, Thorgrim did not know his name, stepped up and handed him a bright, painted red and white wooden disc. "Thank you," Thorgrim said. He had left his own shield behind, because when he had gone after Harald, he had not expected to be racing into battle, and in the agony of running it had slipped his mind entirely. Harald does not have a shield, he thought, nor does Starri. Starri, of course, never carried a shield, because he did not want anything that might interfere with his being killed on the field of battle. But Thorgrim did not like to think about Harald hitting the shield wall with no shield of his own. "Let us go," he shouted, his voice coming back. "Let us go, and let us bring bloody murder to these sons of whores." A cheer went up, loud and gratifying, because the men were charged with fighting spirit, and it had not occurred to them that they did not know who this enemy was, or why they were doing battle with them. Thorgrim turned and headed off across the field once more, his breathing restored, his sense of purpose renewed, because he at least knew why he was fighting. The enemy was closer than he had thought, and that too gave him hope. He could see Harald and Starri ahead of them, halfway between them and the enemy line. Maybe they won't be such fools, Thorgrim thought. Maybe they'll stop before they are cut down. He knew, however, that it was too much to hope that Starri would do the reasonable thing, and he could only hope that Harald would. And so he ran, shield thumping against his side, his soft leather shoes parting the wet grass, ran to get into the fight before any hurt came to his son, his boy whose feelings he had so callously, thoughtlessly brushed aside. There was nothing, Harald realized, that cleared the mind and honed it razor-sharp quite as effectively as a mile run through driving rain at an enemy that outnumbered you 200 to 1. His breath was starting to come hard as he and Starri closed the last 10 rods, running across the field. He had watched the enemy forming from a loose line into a real shield wall, and he was pleased that they considered Starri and him as threat enough that they needed to take such measures. But as the physical exertion drained the fury away, and Harald considered the solid shield wall before him, he began to see that they were not quite the threat he hoped, and that they would be lucky to take even a few of them out before they were cut down. "Starri, "Starry, hold up!" Harald shouted, and Starry came to a stop a few feet ahead of Harald. He turned, and his eyes had that weird look that Harald had seen before, and he knew he could not hold Starry back for long. "Let us at least catch our breath," Harald gasped. The odds were enough against them without their going into the fight gasping for air, though he noticed that Starry was not breathing nearly as hard as he was. 70 feet from the enemy, and Starry began to make low animal noises and spin slowly around like a leaf in a whirlpool. "Just a moment, Starry, just a moment," Harald said, sucking in air as hard as he could and spitting out rainwater. He straightened, and some sound from behind caught his attention. He turned. 200 feet behind, his father and the huge fellow, Godi, were charging at them in a swine array. So that's why they formed a shield wall, Harald thought, embarrassed by his mistake, and glad that he had not mentioned to Starry that he thought the preparations were for them. Starry Deathless saw them as well, and the expression on his face took on a veneer of panic at the thought of missing his chance to attack the shield wall single-handed. "Come along, Harald! Come along! They will be up with us!" he shouted, and then, unable to wait a second longer, turned and raced on toward the line of soldiers ahead. Harald also took a step forward, and then another, building his pace back to a run. He had made the decision to charge the line, even if it had not been made with the clearest mind, and he could not now stop and wait for the others. That would be as much as admitting that his actions had been a mistake, and he would not admit that, even if they were. Starry was now 30 feet ahead, closing fast with the line of soldiers. Harald lifted Vengeance Seeker above his head and reflexively twisted his forearm to readjust the grip on his shield, when he had an unsettling realization. I have no shield. This would take some change of tactics, and he looked up to see how Starry dealt with the problem. Since Starry did not have a shield either, and never did, the berserker was charging hard at a point in the shield wall, and Harald could see the men there ready for him, no doubt baffled by this madman charging straight at them, and all alone. Spears emerged from behind the line of shields, wicked iron points reaching out ahead of the men, ready to impale Starry as he flung himself at the line. Starry was 10 feet from the shield wall when he went down. Harald pulled to a stop and gasped, certain in that second that Starry had tripped and fallen, and would now be run through by 6 spears. But Starry had not tripped. He went down head first and hit the ground with his shoulder, rolled once completely over, and sprung back onto his feet, inches from the shield wall, well past the line of spear tips that were now too far extended to reach him. He let his momentum carry him into the line of men, hitting the round wooden shields with his shoulder. The men who held them were trained to stand fast and hold back the press of an attacking shield wall, but Starry's onslaught took them completely by surprise. Harald could see the looks of shock on their faces as Starry was suddenly on them, smashing a hole in the line, flailing with axe and sword with such maniacal fury that the soldiers within the arc of his weapons could do nothing but hold their shields up and cower. Harald saw a shield splinter under a blow from Starry's battle-axe, saw the short sword drive through the opening that was created, and then a spray of blood, and the man fell away as Starry wrenched the axe free and swung on the next man. And Harald realized, to his disgust, that he had stopped running and was gaping like a little boy witnessing his first fight. He raised Vengeance Seeker over his head, let a shout build as he regained the momentum he had lost, charged the last few rods toward the enemy, eager to get in the fight ahead of his father, eager that everyone should know the truth, that he was no more hesitant than Starry Deathless to plunge into so mad a battle. He was 15 feet away, heading for the edge of the hole Starry had driven in the shield wall, when the men there saw him coming. A second before, all eyes had been on Starry, but in that last instant they saw Harald coming, and the spears came out, the black dagger points. Harald thought of Starry's rolling attack, but he doubted he could pull that off, and he did not care to die sprawled at the feet of these men, stabbed like a wild boar. Harald could not roll, but from a dead run he could make himself stop in his tracks. It was a trick he had practiced often, and found quite handy indeed. The heels dig in, the body leans back to check the momentum, and he would render himself motionless when the instant before he had been at a full run. He was now just feet away from the nearest spear point, and he could see the look on the faces of the men bearing the spears, the certainty that he would run right onto them. But then he slammed to a stop, so close the nearest spear tip was touching his chainmail, and just as the surprised soldier tried to thrust further, Harald swung Vengeance-Seeker around in a great arc, knocking the spears aside, then leapt forward, past the spear points, right at the men in the line. The men in the shield wall had been knocked once by Starry's attack, and now Harald's threw them off balance again. Harald reached out with his left hand, grabbed the upper edge of the shield nearest to him and jerked it close, pulling the man who held it along too. To his right, someone tried to drive a sword into his gut, but Harald twisted the shield in the way of the thrust. He swept Vengeance-Seeker down between the two shields, felt the blade hit steel as he indiscriminately knocked weapons aside. The one whose shield Harald held was tugging it back, trying to break it free from Harald's iron grip. He drew his sword back, as if to cleave Harald's head in two, but before he could bring it down, Harald lashed out with his fist, his sword still clamped in his hand, and punched the man full in the face. His nose crumpled under the blow, and his helmet went askew, and he staggered away. Harald deftly twisted the shield out of his grip as he fell, then held it up, wrong side too, as a spear struck out through the press of men, aimed square at his heart. The shield took the thrust, and Harald twisted it free, flipped it over, thrust his arm through the leather strap, and took hold of the iron grip behind the boss, even as he raised Vengeance-Seeker and warded off another blow. Very well, I have a shield, he thought. Now he was ready to join the battle in a serious way. To his right, Starry was unleashing his berserker rage on the Irish. Harald could not actually see the man, just flailing weapons, and bleeding men-at-arms crawling across the grass or lying still. The screaming was constant, some Starry's, some the soldiers', and under it the snapping of weapons, the renting of wood, and a crunching sound that Harald did not like to think on. Harald Broadarm slammed against the shield wall again, but this time it did not move, and he reached out with Vengeance-Seeker for a target, thrust and parried. He was in a bad place. It took a shield wall to fight a shield wall, not one man, no matter how good he was. Even Starry would soon be overwhelmed, and these men-at-arms, knew their business. Harald could see them, starting to step out to his right and left, extending that portion of the shield wall around, and soon he would be fighting men on three sides, and he could not do that for long. Go back! Go back! The thought rang in his head, but it was a hateful thought. Retreat. Disgrace. It was not what he had been trained to do. It was not their way, the Northmen. So he parried another blow and thrust again. He caught a movement to his left, someone advancing from the shield wall, and he swung his shield around to deflect the thrust of his sword. But now he was exposed on the front. A spear tip like a snake strike, whipped out, and he just managed to knock it aside with his sword. Shield back in front, but now there was someone to his right, and before he could react, something unyielding as stone struck him on the side of the head. He stumbled, saw the ground whirl past, the men in front of him strangely indistinct. He tried to make the images clear in his eyes, but he could not. And suddenly, through the blur of rain and muted colours, he thought he saw his father and the big man, the one called Goddy, charging past on either side. Chapter 44. I raise the ring, the clasp that is worn, on the shield-splitting arm, on to my rod of the battle storm, in praise of the feeder of ravens. Egil Saga. That brief moment, when Thorgrim had stopped and set the men in the swine array, made the difference. It allowed him to catch his breath, allowed him to go on again. But the revivification did not last long. Running in mail was never an easy task, and the mail shirt he had borrowed from one of Owenolf's men was not particularly light, and so he soon found himself once again gasping for breath. To make matters worse, he had to keep pace with Goddy, who, with each step, covered half again as much distance as Thorgrim did. In his favour was the fact that a swine array did not want to go into battle at a full-out run. Better to hit the shield wall at a fast but controlled pace. Thus, it was not entirely for his own benefit that he called for Goddy, and the men in the front ranks to slow to a jog. 30 feet from the line, and he could see Harald fighting for his life, and doing a very credible job of it. But there was only so much one man could do against a shield wall, only so long he could hold out. A minute more. Harald, stand fast for a minute more. To the right of where Harald was making his stand, there was a great whirl of activity, a chaotic, wild fighting, like two packs of wolves tearing into one another. Thorgrim guessed that in the middle of all that, he would find Starry deathless. He changed the angle of his advance a bit, so that he and Goddy would hit the shield wall just to Harald's left side. 15 feet now. The faces of the men-at-arms behind the shields clear and sharp, the grunt and clang and rent of battle loud in his ears. It all worked on Thorgrim's spirit, and he felt a new energy surge through him, and he felt the battle cry build, and then burst out, as if it was not something that came from him at all, but some other living thing, desperate for escape. He saw the concentration on the faces of his enemy. He saw the fear, and then he and Goddy slammed into the shield wall like a breaking wave, and behind them he sensed more than saw the rest of the Northmen hitting the wall, spreading down its length as surge after surge slammed into the enemy's defence. The men-at-arms staggered and stepped back under the power of the impact. Viking weapons rose and fell, reaching beyond the edge of the shields, or thrusting in those gaps that could be found between the overlapping discs. To Thorgrim's right, one of the Northmen tried too late to deflect a spear thrust. The weapon caught him under the chin, and the combined force of the thrust and his forward momentum drove the point home until it erupted from the back of his skull in a welter of blood and bone. The man flailed, but he did not scream, because he was dead before the reflex to scream even hit him, and he went down, the spear still through his skull, an Irishman disarmed. Irontooth was a thing of beautiful balance, a long, straight, double-edged blade with a leather and wire-bound grip, and a heavy pommel to counterbalance the weight of the steel. Thorgrim used that to good advantage, not hacking, as if his weapon was a battle-axe, but thrusting, over and between the shields, looking for his targets and lashing out with a skill honed by long practice on straw men. The shield wall wavered. The men took half a step back. Thorgrim could feel them giving. Somewhere to his left, he heard one of the Irishmen scream, a scream of terror like a woman. He saw the man turn and run, deserting his comrades, flinging his weapons away. He made it 10 feet before one of the Irish officers put a sword through his gut. The wall where he had left a hole closed up again, the disciplined move of well-trained men. "Push them back! Push them back!" Thorgrim shouted. Godi at his side was fighting like a fury, his shield like a battering ram, his massive body exerting tremendous force against the line, as his sword slashed at anything within his substantial reach. Thorgrim caught a glimpse of Harald. The boy was bleeding from a laceration to his face, but it did not look too bad, and with the effort he was putting into the fight, Thorgrim guessed he did not even know the cut was there. Some commotion on his right, and Thorgrim stole a glance, enough to see the great bulk of Olaf the Restless pushing his way through his own men to get at the shield wall, and the Irish beyond. He had reached the line at last, after the great effort of humping it over nearly a mile of open ground, but the fight was in him now, and like Thorgrim, he seemed to forget age and exhaustion as he thrust his shield against the Irish wall, and wielded his battle-axe as Thorgrim had seen him do 100 times before, in 100 different fights, in a dozen lands, in more than 20 years of going a Viking. Again the shield wall shifted just a bit, the Irishman taking a half a step back. But that was a start, a weakening, and Thorgrim knew it meant they would break soon. But as he lashed out with Iron Tooth, he saw something he did not expect. More men, fresh men, coming to that weak spot in the shield wall, rushing to shore it up. Reinforcements. The buggers have held men back, Thorgrim thought, and he knew for certain now that they were not fighting a bunch of farmers, but soldiers who knew their business. And why are we fighting? He thought, and he realized he did not have an answer for that, not really. And then a horn sounded, loud, cutting like a sharp sword through the noise of the battle, the drumming of rain. It sounded again, and was joined by another, and then another. And whatever it meant, the Irish at least understood. The shield wall stepped back and back again, not a retreat, really, but a disciplined disengagement, a coordinated move. The shields were held chest high, and the weapons held back, ready to strike, but they did not strike. Up and down the line, the sound of the fighting fell away, as the Irish backed off, not yielding, but not fighting either, and the Northmen, not understanding what was going on, stepped back as well, and let weary arms hang at their sides, weapons in hand. There was a bustling to Thorgrim's right, and he saw 4 of the Norsemen haul a frantic, flailing, starry Deathless out of the mass of Irishmen. His eyes were wide, and he seemed to be foaming at the mouth, and he was as covered in blood as if he had painted himself. Thorgrim rushed over to where, with great difficulty, the 4 were holding Starry down, while Starry in turn lashed out and kicked and twisted. "Starry! Starry!" Thorgrim knelt beside the berserker and yelled in his face. Starry's wild eyes rolled over and caught Thorgrim's and held them. Thorgrim put his hand on Starry's shoulder, and he felt the man relax under his touch. "Let him go," Thorgrim said to the 4, and they released him, then leapt to their feet and backed off quick, eager to get out of the way. "What is it? What's happening?" Starry asked. "I don't know," Thorgrim said. The horns were still sounding, but now no one was moving. Up and down the line, Irishmen and Vikings stood, a few yards between them, and they waited for what would come next. "Are we dead?" Starry asked.
"More or less,"
Thorgrim said. He stood, and Starry sat up and looked around. There was some movement off to the right, the shield wall swinging back, opening up. Then, to Thorgrim's astonishment, a tall white horse appeared through the parted men, and on its back, in a robe edged with gold trim, sat Princess Bridget. She held a sword in her hands, and she held it with surprising authority, not the timid, unfamiliar grip with which he had seen other women not from his homeland, hold weapons. Bridget held the weapon like a woman accustomed to holding swords, and from her high perch she searched the faces of the men who were now silent and looking up at her. "Harald!" she shouted, when she finally saw Harald Thorgrimsson among the Northmen. "Harald!" Harald stepped forward, a curious look on his face. Anger, confusion, uncertainty. Bridget called out more words in her Irish tongue. Harald nodded, said a few words back. Then, in a commanding voice, a voice that carried over the length of the field, he called, "Princess Bridget Neek Mor Sheknel has asked that I translate her words. It is her you see before you." He nodded to Bridget, and Bridget went on again in her odd language. Harald listening close and nodding. "She says that we Northmen came with her to help restore her to the throne of Tara, that we were promised gold and silver for our efforts." He paused, as Bridget added more. "She says that has not changed, that we should not fight her, that we should join with her and these men to defeat the army at Tara. Then the gold and silver will be ours." If Bridget had expected shouts of agreement, a rousing cheer of excitement at this alliance, then Thorgrim figured she must have been disappointed. The Norsemen made no sound, just stood their ground and stared at her. Silence hung over the field, making the rain sound louder still. "Night Wolf," Starry said, standing, "I don't think this is Valhalla." The rain was washing the blood away, not evenly, but in patches, and it made Starry look even more nightmarish than before. "By the gods," he said, looking around, "Valhalla damned well be better than this." Bridget spoke again, her voice loud, a tone of command. Harald translated. "What say you?" A voice came rolling down from the far end of the line, and Thorgrim recognized it as belonging to Rolleif the Stout.
"I say we've had enough of these lying Irishmen," he shouted.
Men stepped aside, and Rolleif came stamping down toward the break in the line, pointing at Bridget.
"And worse, these lying Irish wenches."
That elicited a murmur from the men. Thorgrim looked at Harald, and he could see the boy was struggling with how, or if, to translate those words. But then another voice came through the rain, a voice that made Thorgrim flush with anger at the mere sound of it, a voice that brought equal measures loathing and revulsion. Armbjorn, Whitetooth, pushed his way to the center of the line in Rolleif's wake, hurrying as if to catch up, a me too quality to his actions. "You do not speak for the men, Rolleif," he shouted. Thorgrim shook his head. This was pathetic. If Armbjorn had ever held any position of command, it was clearly gone now. He sounded more like a nagging housewife than a jarl commanding herdmen.
"Nor do you, Armbjorn,"
Rolleif bellowed back.
"I would not follow you to the privy if I had to puke."
Ingolf stepped up. "We will meet on this in council. All the lead men must discuss this," he shouted, and that met with a murmur of approval, because it was the first sensible thing anyone had said. Harald's eyes met Thorgrim's, and Thorgrim could see in them a plea for guidance. Thorgrim nodded, and Harald translated Ingolf's words to Bridget. Bridget answered, and Harald called out, "The princess sees the wisdom of this, but she begs you hurry, as we must attack soon. Every minute we delay, the defences of Tara will grow stronger." The lead men broke from the line of Norsemen and retreated to a spot a dozen yards away. Arnbjorn and Botley Thorvaldsson, Rolleif, Ingolf, Owenolf. Thorgrim slid Irontooth into his scabbard and headed toward the group, then stopped and turned. "Harald," he called, "join us." Harald hurried over, looking surprised and uneasy. "Why, father? I'm no Jarl, or even herdman."
"No," Thorgrim agreed, "but you are the only one who has any idea of what is going on here."
Rourke MacBrain sat upon his chestnut mare and watched as Bridget expertly swung her horse around and walked it back to where he and Brendan MacAden and the others waited. This had been her idea, and he had been more than a little sceptical at first, but now he was starting to think she was right. The sharp note of the horns sounding disengage, the men-at-arms stepping the shield wall back, had been enough to stop the Northmen from fighting. Now they might be swayed to change allegiances, or change them back, or some accursed thing. He could hardly keep it straight. "They are talking, Lord Rourke," Bridget said. From his horse, Rourke could see that a horde of them had gone off for a private conference. These he took to be their leaders, though with that heathen swine one could not tell leaders from stable hands. "Very well. Let us hope they come to the right decision." Rourke MacBrain did not mind fighting. In fact, he rather liked a good battle. But he could not tolerate pointless violence, could not stand to see men's lives thrown away for nothing. And that was exactly what had been happening just minutes before. Why these men, who had come with Bridget from Duvlin, had been tricked and nearly killed by Flann Mac Canang, had then turned on him, whom they did not know, he could not imagine. Bridget was quick to ascribe it to animal stupidity. Rourke would not generally be satisfied with so simple an answer, but try as he might, he could think of no other. "Do you have a feel for their mood? Will they join us in arms?" Rourke asked. "I don't know," Bridget said. The rain had turned her wavy hair into straight tendrils, and her formerly ruddy complexion was white, making her look as if she had drowned. But the rain, at last, was starting to ease. "I don't know," Bridget said again, looking not at Rourke, but at the Viking leaders gathered some ways off. "They are animals, you know, and they are governed by their appetites alone. Appetites for silver and gold, food, women. If they can conjure up one intelligent thought between the lot of them, they'll realize that those things will not be had fighting you, only by taking Tara." "And if we take Tara, what then?" Rourke asked. "We round up what gold and silver is there and hand it to them." Bridget turned to him quick, as if surprised by his words. "Dear God, no," she said, and there was a hardness to her voice that he would not have expected from one so young and lovely as Bridget Neek Molsheknal. "They cannot be suffered to live. We send them in first, against Flann's men, and any who live through that, we kill them like the rabid dogs they are." "Indeed," Rourke said. He looked off at the gathering of leaders. He could see arms waving, an animated discussion. He was not certain how comfortable he was with this, to form an alliance with these men and then butcher them. He was not sure. "My Lord Rourke," Bridget said, as if he had voiced his doubts out loud, "these are not Irishmen, and they are not Christians. They come to our land, take what they wish, plunder our churches, rape and enslave our women. They try to crush the true faith underfoot, and they will not stop. If there was a pack of wolves on your lands, killing your sheep, You would hunt them down and kill them all, by whatever means available. Well, sir, there is a pack of wolves in your lands.
Rourke nodded. Every word she spoke was true, and the threat from the Northmen was real, and it was here. She was right. They could not be suffered to live. Before he could reply, he saw the council of leaders was breaking up, that the men had come to some sort of decision. They approached the line. Leading the way was an older man, a huge man with a massive beard and long hair, who seemed to roll as he walked.
"This old sodomite is the one they call Owenolf,"
Bridget said, her contempt clear as the purest water. "He is their leader, lord over these men."
"I don't know the extent of his authority," Bridget said, "but he is a drunkard and a fool, so that would put him in good stead to command the others."
The shield wall opened up wider, and the one called Owenolf stepped through, and the others followed behind like geese in flight. They stopped 10 feet from where Rourke, Bridget, and the others waited, looking down on them from their mounts. A young man, much younger than the others, came and stood by Owenolf's side. Rourke recognized him as the boy who had brought Bridget to their camp. Owenolf spoke in a voice to match his frame. The young man translated the words into a broken but passable Irish.
"I am Owenolf Ravenson, Jarl in East Agder, in Vik."
"Have you come to a decision?" Rourke called, before the old man could continue with his titles. The boy translated, listened to Owenolf's reply, and then said,
"We have. We will join you. We will fight to conquer this place you call Tara, in exchange for the plunder of that place."
Rourke nodded. "I honour your decision, and I welcome your friendship," he said, and the boy translated. "We will advance in a line of battle. We have a battering ram, and we will use it to knock the gate open. My men and your men will use their shields to protect those wielding the ram from arrows. Then, when the gate is broken down, your men will advance through and engage the enemy there, and we shall follow behind and join with you." He waited while the boy stumbled through the translation. When he got to the end, the old man named Owenolf threw back his head and roared with laughter. When he was done, he wiped his eyes and said something to the boy, which the boy translated as,
"Owenolf says, the fight is for the Irish. Norsemen and Irish will go in together."
Rourke had the sense that the boy was softening the words, but it did not matter. "Very well," he called. "We go in together. Let your men form up there." He pointed to the right wing on his line. The boy translated. Owenolf shouted orders, and then others shouted orders, and the Northmen began forming up in a surprisingly coordinated manner. Rourke swung his horse around, so he was addressing Brendan MacAden and the others, his back to the line of men. "Pass the word to your officers," he said. "Once the main gate is battered open, we enter, Irish and Norsemen, and we engage Flan's troops. There are not many, and it should not be any great task to defeat them. Then we turn immediately on the Norsemen, cut them down where they stand. They are a threat, not to be trusted, and we must eliminate them. No quarter." Heads nodded. These men understood. They had been in Rourke MacBrain's service for some time, many years in some instances. They knew he spoke plain, and his judgment was good, and they would do as he instructed. 10 minutes later, the line was formed and ready. Rourke MacBrain called an order in a voice that carried over the wet field, and with an answering shout they rolled forward, Irish and Norsemen, a battle line 300 or more strong, moving inexorably up the hill to Tara. Chapter 45.
They will tunnel beneath God's oratories. Churches will be burned. Irish poem of prophecy, attributed to Beck Mac Day. It was all visible from the walls of Tara. They could see it, but they could not understand it. Morgan, Flann Mac Canang, and a few others watched it play out, as if they were Romans of old watching a battle in the Colosseum, staged for their amusement. In this instance, however, the outcome mattered far more to them than a few coins they might have bet on one side or the other. They watched Rourke MacBrain's men assemble, as Arembjorn and the Norse army rushed from the gate of Tara. For a moment, it looked as if Arembjorn was going to retreat, but then, as if conjured up from thin air, another horde of Norsemen appeared, racing across the far end of the field and falling on Rourke's left flank. No doubt greatly encouraged by this, Arembjorn's men immediately advanced against Rourke's right. Morrigan stood by her brother and said nothing, but in mind and spirit she was near ecstasy as she watched her plan play out, just as she had imagined. Better, in fact, than she had imagined. Her hope had been only for Arembjorn to inflict some debilitating hurt on Rourke MacBrain before Rourke killed the Norseman to a man. She had not known about this other army, and now it looked as if Rourke MacBrain's army would be the one destroyed, and the Northmen left crippled. And that was good, because the Northmen were not interested in sitting on the throne of Tara, as Rourke no doubt was. Once Arembjorn's troops stopped their cowardly retreat and advanced, the fighting quickly enveloped the whole line, a great bloody struggle, which Morrigan was privileged to witness from her high, safe vantage. And then the horns sounded, their clear note easily heard from the walls of Tara, and, inexplicably, the fighting stopped. What had happened, she could not imagine, and when she asked, Flann admitted that he, too, had no notion of what was taking place on the far field. The fighting stopped. The two lines, Irish and Viking, separated. For long minutes no one seemed to be doing anything, and then the Vikings were moving again, but rather than renewing their attack, they fell into the Irish battle line. Facing Tara, all of them, shields making a long row of bright dots in the wet grey afternoon, all of them facing Tara, and then they began to move. "They have made a peace," Flann said, soft with resignation. "They have made a peace, and joined together to fall on Tara." They watched in silence for a minute more, while the long line moved forward as one, building momentum as it came. "What Rourke MacBrain might have said to those heathens, I cannot imagine," Flann said at last. "What he promised them, once they have taken Tara, I do not like to think on." "What will you do, brother?" Morrigan asked. "There is not much we can do. We will have our men on the walls, defending with spears and arrows, but they will have a battering ram, I have no doubt, and they will beat the doors of the gate down. It will not take them long. Then we'll fight them as they come." "No," Morrigan said, frightened by what he was suggesting. "No," she said again. "There must be something else." Her mind was flailing like someone thrown into the sea, someone who could not swim. "Let me think." "Sister," Flann said, and his voice did not carry the harsh tone that it had these past days. It was soft, almost tender. "You're a clever girl, and you've done a great deal. You nearly saved us before, but the time for tricks is past. Now is the time to stand like men." He turned and headed for the ladder. "No, brother, wait," she said, and Flann stopped and turned. She ran to him, stood very close, and spoke softly. "You need not do this. There is a back way out, you know that, We can take horses. We'll take Donald and Patrick, and we'll ride hard. We can be miles gone before the gate is battered down."
Flann did not say anything. He just smiled a thin smile. Then he did something he had not done in a long time. He took her in his arms and hugged her, softly, and kissed the top of her head, the way he used to when she was a little girl, and she had scraped her knee, and he was the only one to comfort her.
"God go with you, sister," he said, "and pray for me, because I have put my soul in great peril."
Then he turned and hurried down the ladder, his officers following behind. Morgan stood on the wall and watched him. She watched him as he crossed the open ground with bold strides, his arms waving as he issued orders, and the men falling in, making two lines, one behind the other, facing the gate that would be battered down, forming a human wall against the tide that would rush in. This was when Flann was at his best, she knew, when he most felt he was doing what God had made him to do, leading men into battle, not ordering them into battle, leading them. She turned and looked out at the line moving up the hill, the impossibly long line of men, more visible now as they grew closer, the shields distinct as individual circles, the helmets gleaming dull and wet in the slacking rain. Then she looked back at her brother. He was talking with his officers now, putting a reassuring hand on their shoulders, gripping their arms. All my clever manipulations, she thought. She had done this, all of it, since she first conceived of setting the lineage of Flann mac Conaill on the throne of Tara. This had all, in one way or another, come about because of her plans and her tricks and her damned pride. And now she had killed Flann, her beloved brother, the only person in all the world she really loved. She had killed him as sure as if she had driven a dagger through his heart. The tears came with that realization. She could feel them welling up in her eyes, and she could feel them rolling warm down her cold, wet cheeks. She ran along the wall and down the ladder, her feet slipping on the rungs, finding their place again. For her sins, her brother would die, and the heathens would rape Tara and unleash their horrible vengeance on her people. She did not consider what might happen to her. She didn't care, and in truth would have been happy for any torment that might help erase the pain of what she had done, any horror that could be visited on her that might distract from the anguish she was suffering now. She stumbled blindly across the open ground, past the lines of men readying for the moment when Tara's gate would be battered down, and those being deployed to the top of the wall with spears and arrows. She ran through the ankle-deep puddles and the mud that sucked at her shoes and grabbed at her feet as if trying to stop her flight, to drag her down to some place of torment beneath the earth. She ran past the royal residence with its new build section, the fresh, clean daub and new thatch, clearly delineating the border between it and the original house. She had ordered the new section to be built bigger, grander than it had been, a monument to her hubris and greed. At last she came to the lovely church, the sanctuary, the place she loved above all others within the walls of Tara. She pulled the doors open. The space was in twilight, with the rain outside, and no candles lit. The house of worship, now a scene of frantic confusion, the monks rushing about with an urgency that bordered on panic. In the northern corner of the church, a grave was open, the flat, heavy stone that marked the resting place of Blessed Cummian, 5th Abbot of Tara, moved aside and settled on wooden blocks. Unbeknown to all but the monks and a select few others, there was no Blessed Cummian, 5th Abbot of Tara, and never had been. The grave was a hiding place,
and the monks were now carrying armfuls of gold and silver chalices and incensers, plates, bowls, reliquaries, Bibles, and prayer books with gold and jewel-encrusted covers, wine ladles, monstrances, gold chains and croziers, all the considerable wealth of the monastery at Tara, and placing it all in the hole in the floor that ostensibly housed an innocuous abbot 150 years dead. Morrigan paid no attention to any of this activity. She could not think of it, or of protecting Tara, or hiding its wealth, or anything at all beyond the spreading and perhaps irremovable stain on her soul. She knelt before the altar, the tears now running down her cheeks with abandon. She made the sign of the cross and began to pray, and then, aware of how insufficient that gesture was, laid herself out, face down, arms outspread on the mat of rushes on the floor. In that position of supplication, she began to pray, for her brother, for the people of Tara, for her enemies, and lastly, for her own damaged soul. She prayed as she had not prayed in years, the way she had prayed when she was a little girl, the way she had prayed when she had been first taken by the Norsemen all those years before her life had become one nightmare of pain and humiliation built on another, and she had abandoned prayer in any meaningful way and let hate and doubt and ambition take its place. Soon Morrigan was lost in her prayers, oblivious to the world beyond the spiritual world in which she had entered. It was only when a sound intruded on her prayers, a sound so rhythmic and insistent that she could not ignore it, that she returned from that place where she had gone. She had no notion of how much time had passed. The monks had left, and blessed Cumean stone was back in place. She cocked her head and listened. Boom, boom, boom. She did not recognize the sound, had never heard the like before. It was like a hand knocking on a door, a giant hand on a giant door. Yes, she thought, understanding at last what she was hearing. That is exactly what it is. It was a battering ram, and it was knocking down the gates of Tara. I am glad they are not all like this, these Irishmen, Thorgrim thought, as he watched the men-at-arms deploying the battering ram. The ram itself was no great marvel, just a substantial tree trunk with an iron cap, and smaller crosspieces lashed beneath at regular intervals, to serve as handles for the men wielding the device. What impressed him was the ease with which they had brought it into place, manned the grips while the others spread out and held their shields aloft to protect against a potential rain of spears or arrows. There had been few orders given. The men simply knew what to do, and they did it. If every Irish army were disciplined like these, and if they did not all fight one another, we would be driven from this land in a week, Thorgrim thought. But that was not quite true, and he knew it. The Vikings represented a potent military force which, for a price, one Irish king could deploy against another, as was happening now. The Viking, with their raids, represented a redistribution of riches, which worked to the benefit of many Irish. Viking trade brought Irish goods to the world, and the world's goods to Ireland, in a way that the land-bound natives of this island never could. The Irish might bemoan the Norse sacking their Christ-god temples and monasteries, but Thorgrim knew for a fact that the Irish plundered their rivals' temples as frequently as ever the Vikings did. No, for all their hatred of the Fingal and the Dovgal, the Irish found the Norsemen useful in 100 ways. Perhaps we are here to stay, Thorgrim thought, but not me. All this he considered, as he watched the Irish take hold of the battering ram, and with a rhythmic shout slam its iron-tipped end against the great oak gates of Tara. The doors shuddered and moved a bit, but held, and the men with the ram drew it back and slammed it into the doors again. On either side of them, more men-at-arms held shields aloft to defend against the occasional spear that darted down from the wall above, but there was little threat from that direction. 20 feet behind the battering ram, Norse archers stood poised with arrows nocked in bows, ready to pick off any of the defenders of Tara who showed themselves on the wall. After the first 3 or 4 Irishmen had been flung back, screaming, arrows jutting from their bodies, the people on the other side had come to understand the deadly accuracy of the Viking bowmen, and the number of men who mounted the wall to interfere with the battering had dropped precipitously. Behind the archers, and spread out in a loose V formation, the rest of them, Norsemen and Irish, waited for the big door to break down, for their moment to rush in. The battering ram hit again, and the doors moved a bit. It hit again, and a gap opened up between them, and splinters appeared where the ram had struck. The men at the handholds swung it back, swung it forward again and again, in a regular rhythm that made the door gape and jump with each blow. The Northmen around Thorgrim took a small step forward, as if drawn by the sound of the splintering wood. He could see hands readjusting their grips on weapons, men shrugging their shoulders and working the kinks out of their arms. Starry was doing that weird, whirling thing he did when he was having trouble containing himself. And then another crash of the ram against the gate, and this one sounded different. Thorgrim looked up in time to see the big doors crash open, a gap of several feet appearing between them, as the bar holding them closed gave way under the relentless pounding. A shout rose up from the waiting men. The ram was tossed aside, and the men in the front ranks pushed the doors more open still, the main gate wide enough to let a dozen men enter abreast. They began to crowd forward, every man eager to get in through the gap, to get at the enemy. Then, suddenly, the space beyond the doors bloomed with light, as a great column of flame rose up just within the walls. They were shrieking from the front, and orders shouted in the Irish language that Thorgrim could not understand. But Thorgrim smiled and thought, smart. These Irish can be smart when they wish. Tara's defenders had stacked flammables just inside the gate. Thorgrim guessed it was straw, no doubt soaked with some sort of oil, since nothing would burn otherwise on a day such as that. They had waited until the doors had been smashed open, the enemy surging through before touching it off. Where the walls of dirt and oak could not keep this attacking army back, they had set a wall of flames. But that would not hold their enemy back either, not for long. The men in the front ranks, Irish men-at-arms and Vikings, charged forward, shields held high to deflect the flames as they would any other weapon. They kicked the burning material aside, but as they did, the real defense, arrows and spears from the Irish ranks within, came ripping through the columns of flame, fired by men hidden behind the fire. Thorgrim pushed forward, Harald at his side. He was eager as any to get into the fight, but experienced enough to know it did no one any good for them to crowd and jam into the relatively narrow gate. He reached over and put a hand on Harald, restraining the boy. "Do not forget what we are about," he shouted over the din, and Harald nodded. Thorgrim looked to his right, where Starry had been, but the berserker was no longer there, which was no surprise. Thorgrim looked ahead, just in time to see Starry literally climb over another man's back and launch himself off the man's shoulders at something unseen beyond the press of struggling warriors. Just inside the gate, a line of men-at-arms kicked at the burning material and battered it with their shields, fighting to make a hole. 2 of them were flung back like they had been gored by bulls, arrows buried in their chests, and 2 more stepped up to take their place. The fire and the arrows and spears were taking their toll, but it was clear to Thorgrim, and must have been clear to all, that the defenders could do nothing to hold the attacking army back for more than a minute or so. I wonder what other surprises they have waiting for us, Thorgrim thought. Morrigan, what have you conjured up? We shall know directly. There was a gap now in what had been a solid wall of flame. The front ranks had managed to knock the burning straw aside and made a passage through the fire. Now Irish and Norse were pushing through, pouring through the gap. Thorgrim could see the ranks of men beyond the flames. 2 ranks, shields ready, and archers and men with spears in the front, taking down the enemy as they came. But the gap in the flames grew wider as more and more men pushed through, and the archers tossed their bows aside and drew swords, readying themselves for the bloody hand-to-hand fighting that would come. The Irish troops, Bridget's troops, charged the line, a semi-organized attack that drove the defenders back a step, but they did not break or yield. All along the line, the swords rose and fell, the sound of shouting and metal on metal, metal on wood and shield, and the links of mail shirts rolled around the ringfort. But the Norsemen were holding back. The very men who would otherwise have been in the front ranks of the bloody fighting were 3 paces behind, and they did not look eager to take part, because it was, in truth, not their fight. Thorgrim and Harald were through the gate, through the last of the burning straw and the choking smoke, and the great inner grounds of Tara lay before them. The many buildings, round and wattle built, or tall and square and framed with heavy beams. It was an impressive sight. "There, father, there!" Harald pointed with his sword, and Thorgrim followed the direction of the blade. 200 rods away stood a building framed with black timbers, its daub walls whitewashed, a tall, proud-looking structure. Not the largest within the walls, but set off from the rest in a way that gave it an air of importance. It had a tall spire, and on top of it a great wooden cross, a massive version of the tiny silver one Thorgrim had strung around his neck, along with the silver hammer of Thor. "This way, Northmen! With me!" Thorgrim shouted, Iron-Tooth above his head, waving and pointing in the direction of the church. The others, Owenolf, Rolleif, Ingolf, even Arembjorn, took up the call, shouting in words that Thorgrim knew would be as unintelligible to the Irish as the Irish tongue was to him. "This way! This way!" The Norsemen who had come with Arembjorn, and who had come with Owenolf, began to peel away from the line and fall in with Thorgrim and the other leaders. The men whom Thorgrim had designated to bring Starry along dragged him out of the fight, shrieking and flailing, and pulled him after the others. Soon they had their backs to the Irishmen, still fighting in 2 lines of battle, contending for the throne of Tara, while the men from Duvlin, the men from across the sea, raced through the mud and standing water toward the church and the riches to be found there. Because, in the council of the Jarls, held back on the rain-soaked field, Harald had assured them all that they could not believe a single promise made by these Irish, that the Irish would betray the Norsemen every time. This advice had fallen on ears quite ready to believe it. If they wanted the wealth of Tara, Harald suggested, then they had better go in and take it themselves, because it would not be offered up, no matter what they were told. The others agreed, but how, they wondered, might they gather up the plunder and escape, when the Irish army would be at the gate, But Harald had an answer to that as well. There was a back way, he told them, another way out of terror, and he knew where it was. Chapter 46. I felt blood spilled over my shoulders by a corpse net's wielder with his sharp sword. Gisli Sursen's saga. They covered the ground quickly. The one time that Thorgrim looked back at the Irishmen still struggling for ground by the gate, it seemed to him they had not even noticed the Norsemen had deserted them, or if they had, they were far too busy to protest. Either way, it was of no concern. Plunder the church and be gone. Leave these ridiculous struggles for control of Ireland to the Irish. That was all they were thinking of now. Rolleif was the first to reach the door. He threw his massive shoulder against the solid oak, and grunted as he bounced off.
"More of you! Come on! Be a hand here!" he shouted, and eager men leapt forward and began to drive their shoulders against the unyielding door.
Then Ingolf spoke.
"Are you certain it's bolted?"
Rolleif grabbed the iron latch and lifted. The door swung open, and Rolleif made a grunting sound, said something unintelligible, and stepped in. The rest followed behind. The interior of the church was dimly lit by the grey daylight coming in through the tall, narrow windows. There were no candles burning. No one inside the church they could see. The Norsemen spread out slowly in the big space, and no one spoke. The quiet of the church seemed to infect them, and the possible presence of spirits of the Christ God, whose power they could not judge, made them wary and afraid in ways no human could.
"Very well,"
Owenolf said, louder than was necessary, and Thorgrim saw several men start with surprise.
"We have very little time if we don't want to fight our way out of here. Got it? Stand by the door. Keep watch on the battle by the gate. Give warning if they come this way."
Godi nodded and went back to the door, still ajar, and peeked through the narrow gap.
"There'll be gold and silver here somewhere," Ingolf said. "All these churches. They all have gold and silver. Let us find it, quick."
The loud voices, the harsh orders, helped break the spell cast by the quiet of the church, and the men began to fan out, tossing chairs and small tables aside, kicking up the rushes that covered the floor to look for hidden places below. They were moving toward the altar, when one of Ingolf's men, gave a stifled scream, not a particularly manly sound, which made the others freeze and look up. The man was pointing toward the altar, and by the sheepish look on his face, Thorgrim guessed that he now saw the threat was not as terrible as his reaction suggested. "There's someone here," he said. Thorgrim pushed through the men and walked quickly toward the altar. A woman was lying on the floor, flat out, arms spread, and Thorgrim was certain, on seeing her, that she was dead. And as he stepped closer, he was equally certain that he knew who she was. "Morrigan?" he said, his voice low. He was not really expecting an answer, but to his surprise, she turned over and sat up, staring up at him. Her face was wet with tears, her eyes rimmed in red, and she looked at him with an expression such as he had never seen her wear. Confusion, dismay, a lost and distant look. Owenolf stepped up by Thorgrim's side.
"I know you!" he exclaimed. "Why, you are that thrall! Morrigan!"
"We all know her," Thorgrim reminded him, "and we are the worse for it." But Morrigan still looked at them, with an expression like a stunned bird, and said nothing.
"Well, this is a bit of luck," Owenolf declared. "This thrall will know where the churchmen hid their treasure. Come on, Morrigan. Tell us where it is."
But Morrigan just continued to stare, and after some seconds of silence, she slowly shook her head. Arembjorn pushed his way through the press of men. He had a dagger in his hand, and his face was red, his jaw working. "I will make this bitch talk. By the gods, see if I don't," he said, and he advanced on Morrigan. But Thorgrim put a hand on his arm and held him back. "No," he said, tightening his grip as Arembjorn tried to shake it off. "That will do nothing. You will get nothing from her." Thorgrim had spent time enough with Morrigan to know what she was made of, and he guessed that he knew what would loosen her tongue and what would not. "See here, Morrigan," he said, "we are done with fighting you Irish. We mean to plunder this church and be gone, but we do not have much time. If you won't help us find the silver and gold, we'll tear the church apart, and as a diversion, we will set it on fire when we go." He held her eyes, and she held his, and neither spoke, neither moved. Half a minute swept past, and Thorgrim said, loud, still looking at Morrigan, but addressing the others, "Very well. She will not speak. Tear this place apart." He pointed with Irontooth toward the altar. "Start there." Half a dozen men had moved past Thorgrim, past Morrigan, toward the altar, when Morrigan finally spoke. "No, wait." Everyone stopped, and the church was silent, completely silent. Then Morrigan pointed toward the final resting place of Blessed Cummian, 5th Abbot of Tara. With their numbers substantial and their motivation high, it took the Norsemen little time to move the stone and empty out the hoard of treasure hidden in the floor of the church. The sight of all that gold and silver put them in a generous mood, and they were willing even to do as Morrigan asked, removing the relics from the reliquaries before tossing them in the ad hoc sacks made from altar cloths, tearing the bejeweled covers off the Bibles and tossing them in the pile, but leaving the illuminated manuscripts behind. 5 minutes, and they had cleaned out the ersatz grave, and Goddy had called no warning from the door. They could still hear the shout and clash of battle, but it was becoming less frenetic as the combatants grew weary or collapsed from wounds received. "Let us go," Owenolf said in a commanding voice. "Harald, show us the way." The altar cloths were gathered up. The men headed toward the altar, and a small door behind it. Morrigan stood by the open grave, the relics and torn manuscripts at her feet. Arembjorn grabbed her arm, squeezed it, and dragged her along. Thorgrim stopped and turned to him. "What are you doing?" "She comes with me, after all the tricks she has played, the deaths of my men on her head. She will come with me, and she will pay it back in full." "No," Thorgrim said. "She did us a good turn. In Duvlin. She saved Harald's life, and she spared yours. Leave her be." "I care not what she might have done for you. I care only what she did to me and my men." "She was defending her home, her people," Thorgrim said. "Who here would not have done as much? Would you kill her because she outwitted us?" The two men stared at one another, their hatred like a physical presence. Neither spoke, but Thorgrim was aware of the seconds slipping past, and each one lost lessened the chance of their escape. "Leave her," he said with finality. "If you try to take her, by Odin, you will answer to me." He saw Arembjorn release his grip. He turned to follow the rest to the door, when he heard the motion behind, and before he could turn back, he felt the needle point of the dagger pierce his mail shirt and drive in deep, felt the point deflect off his shoulder bone and bury itself in the muscle under his left arm. He rolled around, But Arinbjorn did not let go of the handle, and the action pulled the knife free. Thorgrim could feel the blood running down inside his tunic. Half a second later, the pain came, like forked lightning tearing through his shoulder, his back, his neck. He staggered sideways, his eyes on the knife, dripping blood, still gripped in Arinbjorn's hand. And then they came for Arinbjorn. Harald from one direction, Owenolf from another, swords raised, and Arinbjorn looked left and right in panic. "No!" Thorgrim ordered, surprised at the strength he found in his voice. This had been coming for a long time, and he could not allow Arinbjorn to simply be cut down by 6 swords. His right arm still worked, and neither he nor Arinbjorn carried shields, so he had no need for his left. Fair enough. "Arinbjorn and I will settle this," Thorgrim said, raising Irontooth and feeling the shaft of pain as he did, realizing he may have just made his last mistake. "Let no man interfere here." Arinbjorn wiped the blade of his knife on his trouser leg, sheathed it, and drew his sword. Their attacks were simultaneous, the blades coming together, the ring of steel loud in the now silent church, the men forming a circle around the combatants like some sort of human amphitheatre. Thorgrim stood sideways to Arinbjorn, his wounded shoulder well back, lunged and missed. Arinbjorn swept his blade down in an arc, looking for Irontooth, but Thorgrim twisted his sword aside, and Arinbjorn found only air. Thorgrim renewed the attack, and Arinbjorn backed away. The blood was spreading, warm and wet down Thorgrim's back. The pain in his shoulder was such as he had not endured in a long, long time. Arinbjorn swung his blade again, but this time Thorgrim was not fast enough, and Arinbjorn connected with Irontooth and swept it aside. He stepped in and lunged, and, lacking a shield, Thorgrim could do nothing but use his left arm, mail-clad, to parry the thrust. But his arm would barely respond, and as it struck Arinbjorn's sword and pushed it aside, the pain was redoubled. Arinbjorn stepped closer still, too close to use his sword, but with his right hand gripping the hilt, he punched Thorgrim hard in his wounded shoulder. Thorgrim shouted with agony, something he could not recall ever having done. He lashed out at Arinbjorn with his fist, connected with the side of his head, and sent him stumbling back. But the punch was weak, and he knew it, and he could see Arinbjorn had moved more from surprise than from the impact of the blow. There was no sound, save for the two men gasping for breath, and then Goddy's voice came, echoing down the length of the nave. "They've left off fighting," he called. "I see men pointing this way." Arinbjorn attacked again, driven by anger and a desperate need that Thorgrim could see in his eyes. And Thorgrim, growing weaker with each pulse of blood flowing from his wound, could do nothing but step back and step back again, and try to keep Arinbjorn's blade from getting past his defense. He was a leaking cask. The strength was flowing out of him now, and soon he would die, because he could no longer hope to do anything but fend off Arinbjorn's attack, and even that he could not do much longer. "Here they come!" Goddy shouted, and Thorgrim was vaguely aware of a murmur running through the watching Northmen, and then his foot tangled in an overturned chair, and he went down, falling back, straight back. There was something inevitable, even comforting in the fall, as if he was free from the terrible burden of fighting now, as if he would just fall and keep falling until he had fallen clear into oblivion. And then he hit, and the shuddering impact brought another scream of agony to his throat, but he clenched his teeth this time and held it back. Arinbjorn was above him, sword raised, and then the man's throat seemed to explode in a shower of blood. His eyes went wide, and his head snapped back, and he made some weird noise, a liquid noise, and he collapsed, missing Thorgrim by inches, his arm falling across Thorgrim's chest like a lover. Morrigan was standing there now, behind where Arambjorn had been, a blood-tipped sword in her hand. "There," she said, "no man has interfered with your ritual of pagan vengeance. Now take your plunder and go. Perhaps you will trade it all with Lucifer for a cup of water, but I think not." And they went. Thorgrim, supported by Harald on one side, Starry on the other, was half dragged, half carried through the door in the back, the others following behind, so that the church was between them and the Irish men-at-arms, whom Goddy reported cautiously advancing toward them. They crossed the open ground, made for the door, which Harald remembered well, the door that Bridget had led him through so many months before, when she helped him escape from her father's fatal designs. There were no guards this time. Every man who could carry a weapon had been fighting. If they were seen by the Irish, they had no knowledge of it. No shouts, no pursuit. They swung the door open, poured through the opening in the ring-fort walls, made for the woods at the base of the long hill of Tara. The Irish did not come after them. Any lust for combat they may have felt that morning had been sated long before. Morrigan sat amid the ruins of the church, the nave, like her life torn apart, a tumble of broken bits. The damage the Northmen had inflicted before they discovered her prostrate on the floor. They had left through the back door, and soon after Rourke MacBrain's men had come in the front, and they had been none too gentle either, and with less excuse, because they were not looking for plunder. They were just looking to destroy something that was not theirs. Through it all, Morrigan had sat on the edge of an unturned chair, the heavy oak seat that the priest used when he was not at the altar, her eyes fixed on a crucifix lying on the floor. It was made of wood, not silver or gold, and so it had been left behind. Morrigan stared at the carving of her Lord in agony on the cross, and she felt one with him, and she understood that it was not the physical pain, not the pain of nails through hands and feet, which gave him the hurt that consumed him so. She might have wept, but she was far beyond that now. After a while, Rourke's men had left, and still Morrigan sat, unmoving, unsure what she would do, other than simply remain where she was, until she died of hunger and thirst. That would be fine. Would it be suicide? Did it matter? Was there any hope left for her stained and tattered soul? She heard the door open softly, not flung open, but eased just a crack, and she sensed rather than heard someone moving toward her. "Morrigan!" For the first time since the Norseman had carried Thorgrim out the back door, Morrigan lifted her eyes from the crucifix. "Father Finian," she said. It was a simple statement. She was not surprised to see him, because she was far too drained to feel surprise. Finian walked further into the church, looking at the detritus left in the wake of passing hordes. He stopped, just a few feet from Morrigan. "Your brother Flann is dead," he said, his voice soft and compassionate. Morrigan just nodded her head. She already knew that, knew it in her soul. "Rourke MacBrain has taken Tara," Finian continued. "He will put Bridget on the throne, but no harm will come to you. I've seen to that." Morrigan looked at him for a moment, then looked away. "It does not matter," she said. Finian came closer still, until he was inches away. He reached out, and gently pressed his palm against her cheek, and turned her face so she was looking up at him. She saw in his eyes an empathy and a tenderness that she had not seen in many years, and even then she had seen only in her brother's eyes, when they were children, before Flann had come into the service of More Sheknal mac Ruinard, before he had learned how to kill men. "You have suffered greatly, Morrigan," Finian said. "I know that. And now I am to suffer more? That I do not know. I can absolve you of your sins. Beyond that, it is not up to me." Morrigan looked back at the wooden Christ on the cross. Genuine repentance, confession, absolution. These were things she believed were true as the sunrise, but she no longer believed they could be hers. Not after all this. "I can see the repentance in your eyes, my child," Finian said. "Let me hear your confession, and absolution is yours. And then you will help me to remove a great evil, and we will see you off to another place. And I pray, sincerely I do, that it is a better place." Epilogue. The haughty, unshaven horde began to traverse the harbours. Birds' bills with bearded heads were seen, coming from the churches of Ullard. The annals of Ulster. From the ship's after deck, Thorgrim cursed it all. The Liffey, the thick cluster of homes and shops, the earthen walls of the outer defences, the hills rolling away green from the edge of the sea, ugly Duvlin, huddled against the grey river, the smoke hanging low over the thatched roofs. The deck was his deck, the ship his own ship, and he was a richer man now for all the plunder they had taken from Tara. But none of that could ease the bitterness he felt at being here again, once more crawling down the river to Duvlin. That cursed Duvlin, from which the gods seemed unwilling to release him. It was 1 week since the fighting at Tara. They had half carried Thorgrim to the edge of the woods, and there had paused long enough to rig up a stretcher and carry him back to the ships that lay at anchor in the River Boyne. They kept a sharp lookout behind, waiting for the Irish, enraged and hungry for revenge, to burst like a flock of ravens from the ringfort and tear into them. But they never came, and the only impediments that the Northmen encountered on their march to the river were their own weariness and the wounds they had suffered. They removed Thorgrim's mail shirt while he forced himself to remain silent, despite the agony. They cut the blood-encrusted tunic away. It was now that they wanted for Morrigan and her healing ways. But there were men among the Norsemen who had considerable experience in treating battle wounds, and they attended to Thorgrim with skill. The wound was deep, but Arembjorn's dagger had been thin and sharp, and had not ripped up the muscle in its passing. The dried blood was washed away. A poultice was put in place. Bandages wrapped around the ugly laceration. Harald hovered and made himself conspicuously helpful until Thorgrim, biting back the irritation, commanded him to stop. They were underway the next morning, but little wind, and then contrary wind and racing currents, made their voyage back to the Longport a long, wearisome and frustrating endeavour. 6 days under way before they raised Duvlin, and then for 8 hours the mouth of the Liffey remained in sight, as the fleet pulled against the tide with their long oars, the carved heads at the bows removed to not frighten any spirits ashore, and to signal to those watching from the Longport that they did not come with the intent to do harm. The ships were hauled up on the beach, and once again Thorgrim was eased into the stretcher, and with Harald and Starry at his head, and Godi and Ingolf at his feet, Owenolf at his side, keeping up a running soliloquy, They carried him swaying and cursing up the plank road to Alma's house. The forge was cold, and the house quiet, the constant hammering and the hiss of the billow now gone. But Alma was there, and she gasped in surprise to see Thorgrim, and the condition he was in. She ordered him brought inside, and laid out on the bedding in the big room, while she stoked up the fire under the iron pot, and gathered up her medicines, dried nettles, dandelion, St. John's wort. Thorgrim did not doubt they would find a welcome at Alma's hearth. Alma cared about him, he could see that. He could see past everything she was, and see that at her very core the affection she had for him was real. And on a more practical level, she needed him and the other men, Harald, Starry, Owenhoff. She needed them there, because she, an Irish woman alone in the Viking Longport, was in a precarious way without them. And Thorgrim knew her secret. He knew the treachery of which she was guilty. He knew that it had led to many needless deaths among the Norsemen. He knew, and he kept it to himself. She would be grateful for that, and she would be wary of him. But mostly, he was welcome because she cared for him. It was as simple as that. And so Thorgrim lay back on the thick furs and tried to ignore the extraordinary pain in his shoulder and the bustle around him, the voices of the people as they shuffled in and out, and noise from the town crowded around the house, the ring of the hammers and the sounds of labour and commerce, the call of gulls fighting for scraps, and men and women and children living out their lives. He closed his eyes, and he thought of the sea, and he thought of his ship cleaving the dark blue waves, and sending the water curling white down the long run of the hull. He pictured himself at the tiller, shifting the steering board a bit to larboard, a bit to starboard to keep her track straight and true. The track led east. It led away from this accursed Duvlin, this island with its fighting and treachery and pain. It led back to his farm in Vik, his grandchildren, his home. He would heal, and he would take his son and his father-in-law if he would go, and he would gather a crew, and he would steer his ship that way, east, straight and true. It was 6 months after Rourke MacBrain had taken Tara from the pretender Flann, and re-established the line of More Sheknel MacRuinard on the throne. Half a year during which the rains of spring had yielded to summer, and Ireland bloomed with the glorious abundance of that place. The cattle and sheep grew fat, and the brown earth was lost from sight under the great blooms of wheat and barley, before Father Finian had the chance to ride north. And when he did, the rains had come again, bitter cold and driving hard with the advent of autumn, and the harvest was brought in, and the stores laid up for grey winter, and he stood huddled before a peat fire in the scribe's room at the Abbey of Kells, 10 days' ride from Tara. The abbey had stood where it stood for nearly 300 years, and though generations before it had been all but abandoned, it flourished again during the lifetime of Finian's father, when an order of Columban monks had fled there from the edge of the sea that brought the heathen raiders again and again. But even that had not spared the monks from the wrath of the Northmen, who spread like rushes across Ireland, because proximity to the sea was no longer necessary to invite their depredations. Finian held his hands up to the inadequate flame, and then with a flush of guilt he tossed another peat brick onto the fire. It flared and caught. The flame blossomed, and a wave of heat rose up to Finian's numb hands. He had just made some extra work for some peasant, some poor soul who would toil in the peat bog to cut one more brick because he, Finian, felt the need for more warmth. His particular friend, Father Anmere, sat at the tall writing desk behind him. Anmere would not mind the extra peat. It would not even occur to him that Finian was being wasteful, because Anmere was, in Finian's opinion, the most generous of souls. Here indeed was yet another example of that generosity. Anmere was desperately eager to hear what Finian had to say, and Finian knew it well, but his friend was willing to wait with admirable patience as Finian regained his circulation. The wind whipped around the stone walls, and worked his way into the cracks and the windows, and made a whistling and moaning sound. The fire danced in the fireplace, and the flame of the candle on Anmere's desk danced, and the two men enjoyed the moment of companionable silence.
"The devil has been loose in Brega this year, or so I hear from those few travellers who pass this way,"
Anmere said at last.
"The devil has been there, my friend, but the angels too, I'm pleased to say."
Finian turned to face Anmere, and to give his backside a chance to enjoy the delicious warmth of the fire. Anmere's face was all yellow, light, and shadow from the flame of the candle. He reached up and drew a quill from an inkpot, feigning all the indifference he was able to feign. Gossip was a sin, and such eagerness for news unseemly. But Anmere's interest in the goings-on was more than mere curiosity. Before him lay a scrap of vellum, on which he would record those things that Finian told him. Later, he would transcribe those words into the great volume of annals that was his sacred duty, and that of his fellow monks to keep. The annals comprised the history of the land of Ireland, a record of the events of great importance, and a way to mark the passing of the days and months, that allowed them to calculate the proper date for their movable feasts.
"We heard here that Bridget Neak Mulsheknal was wed," Anmere prompted.
"Wed this past spring,
to Conlad U. Chinsley of Ardsala, but it was not a fortunate union. Not a week or more after, there was a fire in the royal house, half the building in ashes. Bridget managed to get out, but Conlad did not." "How did she escape, and not him?"
Anmere asked.
"I don't know. Bridget did not know. She seems to have forgotten all that took place that night. She reckoned Conlad died in saving her."
Anmere's quill scratched at the vellum.
"That was when the devil came to Tara," Finian went on. "Flann was already on the throne, and his sister, Morrigan, held much of the power, and did not seem inclined to give it up. Bridget feared for her life, so she fled."
Scratch, scratch, scratch.
"To where, brother?" "To Dublin at first, I believe," Finian said. "She told me after. She thought there was no place among the Irish where she would be safe, but later she realized the heathens were worse than any Irish might be. So she sought out Roch Mac Brain, who she knew to be a good man, and it was he who restored her to the throne of Tara." "And is it true they are to wed?"
Finian smiled.
"Yes, it's true. Roch is a brave man. Bridget has been married twice thus far, and twice her husbands have come to bad ends."
Scratch, scratch, scratch.
"So there might yet be an heir to the throne of Tara?"
"There is already," Finian said. Anmere looked up from his vellum with a quizzical look, in which Finian took a secret delight.
"A son was born to Bridget about 3 months back."
"How?"
"He is the child of Bridget and Conlad U. Chinsley. They were married but a week, it's true, but a week is time enough. A wedding night is time enough."
And by the light of the candle, Finian saw Anmere blush and turn back to his writing.
"And Flann?"
Anmere asked.
"And Morrigan?"
"Flann was killed in fighting Roch Mac Brain," Finian said. "As to Morrigan, I'll admit to stepping in there and seeing no harm came to her. She did a bad thing, but she was repentant, truly, and forgiven in the eyes of God, and she has suffered a great deal in this life. Anmir wrote.
So, where is she? He asked.
She has joined a holy order. Her life will be spent bringing glory to God. Anmir wrote. And thus is history created, Finian thought.
There is one more thing,
Anmir said, and his tone was slightly embarrassed.
I would not mention it, but we have heard rumours, you know, more than one.
Yes.
There are some that say St. Patrick himself has come back and has visited poor farmers to the south. Have you heard such? I ask because of the annals.
Finian smiled. Yes, I've heard such, he said. But I think I would not put that in your book. Who can tell from where such stories come? It was just over a year after Rourke MacBrain set Bridget Neek Mulsheknel on the throne of Tara, that a certain beamy, squat merchant ship moved listlessly in the light air blowing over the Sea of Marmora. It may have been a distant cousin to the Viking longships, with its single square sail and the smooth run of its sheer, but there the similarities ended. Where the longship was narrow and fast, the merchantman was wide and slow, with a deep, heavy hull, decked over as the longships were not, providing safe storage below for the considerable cargo she carried. Silks and amphora jugs of wine and olive oil, sacks of grain, all the varied commerce that had moved for centuries around the Mediterranean world. The sun beat down on the deck, oppressively hot, like a hand pressing down on the passengers and crew who moved slowly when they moved at all. And there was not much need to move. With that light breeze, it would be an hour at least before they were close enough to the waterfront to think about getting the anchor out, or warping the ship alongside the stone quay. At the after end of the ship, on the raised quarterdeck, where the master and the steersman stood, a small knot of passengers had gathered to watch the approach to the city, their destination after a very long journey. They were silent, almost unwilling to speak, as if their voices might make it all vanish, as if any noise might render it all a dream, because, after all those months, all the hardship, the suffering, the depredation, it did not seem at all possible that they could, at last, be there. Constantinople was spread out along the larboard side of the ship, a great city of towers and grand stone edifices, churches, flags, great houses, surrounded by massive stone walls. Even from that distance they could see the people. So many people. They reckoned in one glance they had laid eyes on more souls than they had seen cumulatively in their lifetimes. And such people! White people and brown and black, in flowing gowns and rich silks, with turbans and veils and helmets and straw hats, some walking, some carried in chairs, some peeking from gilt coaches, pushing through the jammed streets. That much they were able to see from the deck of the ship. It made them wonder what they would find when they finally set foot ashore, and it made them a bit afraid. In all the things they had seen in the year past, things they could not have imagined, the countries through which they had travelled, the cities of Europe, the lands of the Mediterranean, there was nothing that compared to the sight of the Queen of Cities. Morrigan reached for the purse that hung from her belt, concealed under the linen cloak draped over her shoulders. She fingered the soft leather, gauging the contents, and, satisfied, she pulled the knot loose and took the purse in her hands. She crossed the deck, feeling the melting, pitch in the seams, tugging at the bottom of her shoes. She approached the master, who stood, bored, by the steersman. "Sir," she said. They had no common language, she and this fat, swarthy man. He had told her once from which country he came, but the name was meaningless to her. They had no language in common, but by stumbling through Norse and Latin and some of the Gaulish she had picked up, they managed to communicate. They had sailed from Barcelona, which was once more a Christian stronghold, after being wrested from the Moors 2 generations earlier. They had not been far from port before the master managed to communicate that passage might be free in exchange for certain services, and Morrigan in turn communicated that the passage would be paid for in the traditional way. Now she wished to settle that matter before they were alongside the quay. The master looked at her, annoyed. "Yes?" She opened the purse, and withdrew 3 rubies and 3 emeralds, and held them up for his inspection. They were large and perfect, and if he hoped to play coy with her, his bulging eyes had already given him away. "They are all I have, for us." She indicated the 2 with her. The master collected himself, pretended to consider this, then said, "Very well." He held out his leathery palm, and Morrigan dropped the jewels in the cupped hand, and the fingers wrapped around them. It was not entirely true that the 6 jewels were all she had, but she had no qualms about misleading the likes of the ship's master, who was likely no sort of Christian. She had other jewels, and she had silver and gold. It had been enough to get them that far, and still a fortune remained. The jewels had been prized from the rim of the crown of the 3 kingdoms, the silver filigree as well, the massive gold crown itself cut and weighed and melted down, the crown for whom so many had died, for which Morrigan had committed so many sins against God, and now its gold and silver were cast into small ingots, and its jewels scooped into a leather purse, and only she and Finian and Rourke Mac Brain knew it, because they alone had been there when it was done in the blacksmith shop at Tara. They had travelled to the town of Kilventine, which the Northmen called Wickenlow, and there had found a ship, a beamy Na, bound for the Gaulish countries. Finian had negotiated the passage, and they had sailed aboard her, Morrigan and Patrick and Donnell. They had reached Paris, a city of great churches which, like Ireland, had fallen victim to Viking depredations again and again. But, also like the Irish, the Gauls were not adverse to some honest trade with the Northmen, and so the Na reached the quays of the Seine unmolested, and Morrigan and her 2 companions began the long overland journey to Barcelona. It had cost money, but they had money, and they found charity with Christians along the way, who were pleased to hear of their mission and happy to aid them on their journey. Through bitter cold, withering heat, over mountain passes, and across interminable plains, the pilgrims had travelled. They had seen sights they could not have imagined, met people of every possible stripe. They had feared for their lives, and they had thanked God for their deliverance, and they had never wavered in their determination. And now, at last, from the deck of that stubby ship, the great city of Constantinople was spread out before them. Down below, secreted in a hidden place in her trunk, Morrigan still held a small fortune in ingots from the crown and gold and silver that had been donated by those along the way, money for her travels, which, thanks to her frugality and the kindness of others, she had not spent. She had volumes of manuscripts, copied out and illuminated by the monks of Ireland, the great learning of Western civilization preserved, and now sent back to the countries from which it had come. Somewhere out there, in that city, amid the grand edifices to the Christian God, there was a small monastery, a gathering of Columban monks, charged with disseminating the work of the Irish monasteries, and the great troves of literature that had been preserved by them in their far-flung land. And here was Morrigan, who, by Finian's orders, would arrive like an angel from heaven, with the treasure needed to keep that monastery, those monks and their mission alive. Morrigan Neek Canang, ready to start life anew, her pale skin turned brown, her sins washed away, her life resurrected as if bleached white and clean by the sun of the ancient world.